My fellow Westorians, I'm Aziz, with me is Ashea, and this is Valar Rereadis. Yay, applause. A Dance with Dragons is the longest of the books, so far. It's also the darkest and least understood, thanks to being the most recent. It's the culmination, also, so far, of George R. Martin's style, honed over the course of the prior books and the rest of his career. It has the extended length of A Storm of Swords, the expanded pacing of A Feast for Crows. It brings POVs together like A Clash of Kings and has the setup of A Game of Thrones. If you're watching live, you can feel free to ask live questions. You can also send questions and comments and observations ahead of time by joining us on one of our social media outlets and participating in the discussion. Or hey, you can just post and leave if that's your way. Facebook, Flick, Discord, and Slack are the ways to do that. Also, you can interact with me on Twitter as well, at Westeros History. Please check out the Isle of Faces. That's Joe Buckley's podcast. Every week he is in tandem with us, recording his own extra takes, expanding on each chapter. There's always more to say. And of course, he's also put his work into the main episode here that we're talking about right now. Also, please check out Nina's work on Tumblr. That's Good Queen Alley with one L. And her thoughts are throughout every episode as well. Some particularly good takes this week. Join us on Patreon if you wish to support us financially. We also have lots of bonus episodes. We have episodes on Gagassos. We have an episode on the North Remembers chapter. We have some cool stuff like that. We also have the benefit of removing any network ads when you're listening to Valar Rereadis. Yeah, it gets you through a little more efficiently. You can also support us on Anchor. That is Spotify's company. They bought them with their large network of expanding excellence. And Anchor's a wonderful host for us these days. We switched over to them in April. We've been very happy with that. Today we have John 2, the gang reenacts the Tower of Joy, a.k.a. Ed fetches a block.
Tyrion 3, Blackfyres assemble, a.k.a. the gang meets duck and egg.
Davos 1, the gang goes to the sisters, a.k.a. Webbed Fingers and Red Herrings.
And finally, John 3, one realm, one god, one king, a.k.a. the one with Non-Mance burning.
Mm-hmm. We have some significant John Davos Tyrion parallel storytelling here in that they're all dealing with concealed identities and things of that nature. There's a lot of concealed identities and deceptions of that nature. John's been a false identity all along, not beknownst to himself. But the baby swap, of course, is something newer this time around, meaning him doing the baby swap, not being the one who is swapped. Stannis as Azor Ahai also is a bit of a false identity / deception, though it's not an intentional one, as we learn much later. Melisandre is sincere. Of course, here we have one that they're not sincere about. They know that Mance and Rattleshirt is a deception. They're pulling that one off, etc. Of course, we have that with the Blackfyres and Young Griff. There is a lot of false identities and deceptions going on in that plot line. A lot of characters who aren't who they say they are. And as Tyrion likes to point out, a couple who are exactly who they say they are. Then we also have, it's not this week, but Quentin and company are also in a whole bunch of deceptions and false identities. And while we're at it, why not mix in the Three-Eyed Crow and Cold Hands? They just got fed Night's Watch deserters and was told they were pork. We've got Bran pretending to be dead. We've got all sorts of things like that. We've got the night lamp today. That's really interesting. That's certainly a deception. A false light is a little different than a false identity, but it's a similar conception here. We also have people hiding at different places. We have people passing through. Tyrion hiding at Illyrio's manse. Can't allow anyone to know he was there. Ditto Davos at Sweet Sister. Godric Borrell's final words to him. And Davos confirming, I was never here. And that was made possible because of a similar example that happened to Lord Godric Borrell's father when Ned Stark passed through, and ditto, he was never there. We also have one little other fun parallel. There's a lot of lore world building in this episode. The mark of the beast is pointed out by Janos Slynt as to Jon Snow, in reference to him being a warg. But we also have the mark of the Borels with their creepy webbed fingers and hands. Creepy because it's lasted for 5,000 years. If it occurs naturally in the world, it's not creepy. Jon 2. The gang reenacts the Tower of Joy, aka Ed fetches a block. A particularly important and memorable chapter, even if you missed the fact that it's this reenactment of the Tower of Joy circumstances. Well, this chapter's still hard to forget because it's the execution of Janos Slynt, and that's very interesting because it tests us a bit. We don't want to be vindictive people. We don't want to kill and feel good about it. But with Janos Slynt, it's hard to not feel good about seeing him die. That guy is just so awful. It just encapsulates so many character traits that we dislike, that we find disagreeable, that we find hateful. Now, trying to save a boy through painful means, well, yeah, metaphorically and literally, while only metaphorically trying to kill the boy in himself and in Sam. This one is very powerful. It's true even though we don't want to repeat the parts of this chapter that were covered already in Sam 1, A Feast for Crows. This is the famous overlapping Jon-Sam portion. And there's a lot to say even without rehashing the things we talked about in that first one. It starts like this.
Jon Snow read the letter over until the words began to blur and run together.
It's very reminiscent of Jon's problem of not being able to agree to Stannis' deal back in his first chapter, except this time Jon seems much more agitated because, well, he's thinking about the Lannisters. This is a deal with people that he really hates, and he doesn't hate Stannis. He doesn't dislike Stannis nearly to anywhere near the degree he has these feelings for the Lannisters. As Joe points out, this is one of the most constant arcs for Dance Jon. Dance Jon, I like that term. We'll see this battle waged throughout. I would do this if I were a Stark, but I'm not. I'm a Crow, so I can't. So in other words, it's sort of an identity battle where he still has that Stark loyalty. He still is a Stark, but he technically signed that away with his job, especially with Lord Commander. Remember how much this tore at him when he first joined the Watch, when he flat out ran away in order to help Robb and to help avenge Ned's death. So very much he's been fighting that all along. Now it's come a long way since there, but it still pulls at him. And it's going to be even harder when Melisandre starts mentioning his sister to him and saving her. Sam and Jon debate here similarly to how Davos and Lord Borrell debate Stannis' chances, but with one huge difference. The turning point in that chapter, the thing that Davos realizes is the only reason he's alive is that Tywin is dead and that Cersei is in charge. If Tywin were still alive and in charge, Davos would have been executed there at Sweet Sister. Sam and Jon are not taking Tywin into account because they won't learn that until the next chapter that he's dead. Now, the main part here, Jon's concern over a child's life is a direct callback to the man who raised him, the same man who pretended his mother was a wet nurse, just like Gilly is pretending. Or, well, no, she's not pretending. She really is a wet nurse. Eddard Stark was worried about a Baratheon killing Jon, just as Jon is worried about a Baratheon, or at least his Red Priestess, killing a kid who will later be named Aemon, which might have been Jon's intended name. What's more, we saw a lot of this chapter through Sam's POV early in A Feast for Crows, so what George has managed to pull off right in front of our own eyes is a plot line where Jon unwittingly repeats many of the events of his own birth, and he showed it to us in 2 different books. So he did it twice. If you didn't catch the mystery of Jon's birth the first time through, like if you weren't keyed into R plus L equals J, then you certainly couldn't have caught the meta of this repeat version. But even those fully keyed into Jon's parentage, even if you read this book 100% sold on R plus L equals J, you still could have easily missed it. I did. At least the first time. So it's really quite brilliant that he just puts it right in front of us twice, and it's still really easy to miss because there's just so much else going on, and it's just so well done. It's It's the mark of the master. So John does, though, interestingly enough, we have to consider that he may realize it later. He obviously can't figure it out now. He doesn't even know the circumstances of his own birth, so he can't put it all the pieces together. But he will eventually learn about his birth, and then he might go, whoa. So Ned did that, and then he did that, and then he might realize that he did the same thing. He's like, whoa, then I repeated. Oh my God. So it could be quite a bunch of quite a thunderous realization for John to happen all at once like that. Now, he of course feels really guilty about it. So does Ned. That's one thing they have in common. Promise me, Ned, and all the lies he has to tell, and all these things this burden he has to bear. He has to lie to Catelyn. He thinks so anyway, and all these other things. So it's very difficult. And John is feeling some of the same things, at least relevantly similar. And I wonder, John has a much bigger challenge than Ned that Ned did not face, which is the freaking long night. And I wonder if that's the kind of microcosm of the sacrifices needed to survive what could be just an unbelievably painful and excruciating experience, and difficult with all the starvation and lack of resources and things like that. Is Gilly's sacrifice just the beginning? Are we going to kind of see more and more of this type of thing necessary? Not baby swapping, not that specific thing, but really, really tough choices, or people ordering people to do terrible things to prevent more terrible things from happening. I mean, doing one terrible thing to prevent two terrible things. In a nutshell, I guess that's the right play, but in reality, it's hard to do those things and measure them that way. And John's leadership style is a real issue of this book. He's trying to kill the boy, and he doesn't quite get it. He's a little, maybe not even a little, he's too harsh. I think he sees this harshness with maturity, and that's not really always true. It's something I indicated last time. It's partly just who he's had as part of his upbringing. He hasn't had any sort of soft hand to guide him at any point. It's all been kill the boy, or this is the life you have, and bastards have a tough life, and all this stuff. He's never been coddled. Apart from having more privilege than most people, he's never been given that kind of education, even though he's had plenty of education. And you can see Aemon sets the tone here by telling it where this all came from. It was Egg, who of course is going to pop up a lot this episode, at least in Jon 2 and Tyrion 3, and how that was an important thing for him, because Egg was a little boyish still, and becoming king, he had to become a little more responsible, a lot more mature perhaps. But again, that message isn't quite, there's something lost in the translation there. Egg was still very compassionate. Egg's ruling style, even though there's a lot missing that we don't know about it, he certainly, we do know, was pro-commoner. He certainly, which implies a certain level of compassion and understanding of what they went through. Jon is starting off by having less compassion. He sets up this conversation with Gilly by talking to Sam very unfriendly, right? It's almost like he's only a Lord Commander. It's like Jon, you can still be Sam's friend and be the Lord Commander. You don't have to completely cease being friends with everyone because you have this job. That's not maturity. In fact, I would argue that's immature. Everyone needs friends, I think. Maybe not everyone, but you don't have to throw your friends away. Maturity is not throwing away your friends. Joe points to a specific detail here that I think is very telling. We saw earlier Jon be somewhat friendly to some of Stannis' guards and saying, look, you need a warmer pair of gloves. They'll head over there, they'll get you one. That's reasonable. That's good. And that's good leadership. But when Sam comes in and the Raven bites him, pecks through his gloves, Jon's like, wear thicker gloves, dude. It's kind of dismissive of the problem. Now, to be fair, Sam needs to be toughened up perhaps a little bit. But on the other hand, that it's quite a contrast to how he treats these two scenarios that are very similar. one of them is his friends. He's less compassionate towards his friend than this rando guard. But he is all. I'm criticizing him here, but he's also really, really good at so many of these other things. He makes the rounds of Castle Black each day. As Joe points out, he's a lot like Ned, talking to all the men, letting them see him, and being present. And that's undoubtedly good. That's high marks for that one. Now, back to Gilly, though. He forces her when I think it would have been better to appeal to the need here. But again, this is not how Jon himself was educated. Jon was not taught to appeal to need. He was taught that you do your duty. And Jon sees this as Gilly's duty on some level, even though because, well, this child will die if you don't do this. And to him, that means it's your duty. And I sympathize with that take, but that doesn't mean, but I don't sympathize with how he delivered all this. I don't think he had to make Gilly hold her hand over the candle. This is an incredibly, incredibly hard thing he's asking. He doesn't need to force it. He just, she would have come around, I think. So this is a bit rough. I hope he's not this harsh with other people in the future. But we do see it somewhat. He never has the opportunity to do anything quite this harsh, never to take a child from a mother. But he does make very tough decisions as Lord Commander that we'll start to see in this chapter very much are disagreed with, and that, of course, leads to his assassination, which was not justified, but had he led differently, it might not happen. His leadership style is very much forcing things on people, and I don't think that's a good way to go about it. Nina writes that this is perhaps the first test of Jon's chapter, what to do with Gilly and Mance's son, and it might be the cruelest thing Jon ever does. Jon is probably right in terms of Mance's son being in danger. If Stannis were willing to sacrifice his own nephew, and Davos is the only reason that didn't happen, then why not this kid, who is less connected to him, but has this so-called royal blood? So, again, I don't think we need to resell that point. Jon's right enough that this is a danger. But again, that doesn't mean he had to talk to Gilly like that and handle it this way and sell his point that way. So this is still that kill the boy thing. Joe writes a similar point here. The one he literally thinks to himself, kill the boy, while forcing this girl to feel pain. This is definitely not the boy we know, as he commands Gilly to hold her hand over a candle. And interestingly, too, this is a part of the Tower of Joy connection here. Nina writes that Gilly is sort of in this Catelyn role of the Ned, Lyanna, Jon dilemma, that she's been kind of being forced to go along with this. The difference with Catelyn, of course, is that she was not in on the secret, but she still had to live with the circumstances. And, well, the alternative is pretty bad, right? It would be pretty horrible of Ned to abandon his dead sister's infant son, but the preferred alternative still caused Catelyn a lot of pain, and that pain, of course, was pushed back onto Jon. And again, so it's another example of, well, that was a rough thing to do, bring this other child into your home, but the alternative was to let the child die or to be killed. So it's another, that's part of what makes this so parallel to the Tower of Joy, is that it was bad choice or much worse choice. Now, Gilly has a choice in quotes in the matter the same way Ned does. Ned didn't really have a choice. Like we said, like he was the driver of this situation. He was the one that could have said no, but Ned couldn't really say no to his sister and this newborn. He's not going to really say, just like Gilly wouldn't have really said no here. And that's why I think Jon should have convinced her and not ordered her, because she wouldn't have said no. She would not have walked away from that child and said, yeah, let it burn. And while Jon is promising Gilly's son will be taken care of, Gilly is hearing what she was trained to believe was her worst nightmare. It's really important to put yourself in Gilly's perspective here. It's hard to, because it's like, hey, take on this incredible pain for a minute, or try to sympathize with what's this incredible pain. That we think of the Night's Watch as good people. We know that, yeah, they're not all good people, but they're a good institution ultimately. They stand for good things, especially when people like Jon are in charge. But Gilly was raised to believe that the Night's Watch is not good. She's obviously come around on that. She likes Sam, and she sees that everything she's taught, a lot of it wasn't accurate. But still, she still has these emotions. She still has this natural rejection of the Watch and this sort of habitual reaction to them. So it's really quite a reversal. It's really quite a parallel. She was saved, or he was saved, this baby was saved from being given to the others. And now he's being given to the crows. The two biggest powers that exist amongst the wildlings as enemies, the others and the Night's Watch. There's the two forces they're caught between. Her child was going to be given to one, and now it's being given to the other. I mean, it's better than becoming given to the others, but she's certainly capable of understanding that difference obviously, but it's still really awful. And Jon does not really grasp that. And that is part of the criticism here, is that his complete lack of sympathy is not so good. If we were to put ourselves in the baby's position, let alone, we're trying to put ourselves in Gilly's position. Think about this baby's life so far. If it could talk, this is what he would say. A Night's Watch mutiny killed Grandpa Dad before he could give me to ice demons. Saw an undead ranger's ravens kill other undead rangers before they could kill us. Bumped into a green seer and his friends and direwolf and a small hairless giant. I don't know what that was about. At a talking gate in the wall. I could have gone south to sunny Old Town, but Jon Snow made me swap moms with a kid set to be sacrificed to a fire god. And the ice demons and whites are still coming. So now I live at a 700-foot wall. This is this baby's life so far. Like, wow, that is a lot for an infant to have. I was like, he's going to tell these stories later. A Song of Ice and Fire, the footnote, 20 years later, this kid's going to be like, yeah, he's going to be telling these stories at a tavern, and no one's going to believe him. It's like, you didn't do all that. Now, is he actually safe as a baby? That's a big question. Jon tells Gilly that there's no reason for Mel to burn this child. Now, is that true? I'm not sure it is. Mel has burned non-royal blooded people before. Usually, always, they did something wrong. Alistair Florent did something wrong. He was a traitor. And the cannibals in Stannis' army later, well, that was something wrong. I don't think you can argue this child is going to do something wrong other than existing. However, that isn't necessarily something to bank on. And as Flick commenter Rolling Knight points out, the child's identity is unknown to Melisandre. So, and now if Jon is stabbed, then, well, if Melisandre thinks that's still Craster's son, or Mance's son, then maybe she'll just go right on ahead and burn the child, not knowing that it's not really Mance's kid. However, I think we can explain that, because it does seem that later we get confirmation that Val knows. Val has noticed. Val knows the children were swapped, and she says Melisandre knows. She seems quite sure Melisandre's aware of the baby swap and just didn't care, or has her own reasons. So that would have been really horrible, and it still could happen if Val is wrong, that Jon is resurrected via the burning of Mance's child, and he's aware that it's not actually Mance's child. He sees this happening through Ghost's eyes. Whew, that's rough. Now, this is, Nina writes something about Sam and his reaction to being told he's going to be a maester. His reaction to being sent to the South is more overt than Gilly. Gilly handles losing her son better than Sam handles being told he's going to be a maester. But it's just for similar reasons. This is trauma that they are feeling from the abusive father that taught them to denigrate these things, like the Watch or the Citadel. And Nina also wonders if Jon was bothered by Gilly's insistence that a mother can't leave her son or else she's cursed forever, because Jon, whoever his mother was, he perceives that she left him. So that's a personal shot there. Now, of course, Kelly obviously doesn't know she's saying that, and Jon, it doesn't register in Jon's mind. We don't see him react to that, but subconsciously, it might sting a little bit because he feels like he was left by his mother too. Now, the Raven. Let's pay attention to the Raven for a minute. It seems to weigh in on some of these takes here. It seems to agree with Sam, or agree with Jon telling Sam not to show his fear. When Jon orders Sam not to show his fear, the Raven goes, "Obey." and then, but the Raven says no, about the baby swap, during the baby swap. Maybe it's just mimicking Gilly, but we've seen so much of this Raven talking as if it's Blood Raven, or saying things that can't be dismissed as just random. So you got to wonder if maybe the Blood Raven has seen something about this and thinks the baby swap's a bad idea. Maybe because the South actually isn't safer because of Euron. I don't know, but it's an interesting point to consider that the Raven is like, The Raven also says die. So he's, yeah. One other thing the Raven says here, they talked for a while of Manson, Stannis, and Melisandre of Ashai until the Raven ate the last corn kernel and screamed blood. Like, what? The Raven's really mad that the food ran out. Is that a cannibal reference? I don't know, but the Raven was very talkative this chapter. Another quick quote: Ghost slept at the foot of the bed that night, and for once Jon did not dream he was a wolf. So that's very telling. Jon is dreaming of being skin changing in his sleep every night, just about. So that's it's peaking almost, and we saw it in Jon 1. His chapter started that way, but we don't see it in this chapter directly. So of course the whole thing with the paper shield is pretty important. Jon really doesn't like doing. He doesn't like anything to do with Tywin and the Lannisters. But with Janos Slynt, he almost goes back on what he's just done. He's like, okay, fine, the paper shield's better than nothing. He agrees with Sam's points there. But executing a guy who's out here claiming, I have friends in King's Landing, Tywin Lannister is my friend, blah, blah, blah. That's obviously gonna, if that's true, if they really do care about Janos Slynt, then executing the Lannister toady is not exactly going to put them in good graces with the Lannisters. The paper shield is definitely going to be worthless in that spot. But hey, what can you do? Janos disobeyed a direct order. I mean, this isn't that much of a moral conflict. It could have been. It was set up to be. Jon was wrestling with it. He's like, I have blood between my family and this guy's family, and personally. It's outside their relationship and directly related to their relationship. And it could have been a real moral conundrum for Jon, what he's going to do. Like, how do I handle this guy he's going to come kill me and still do my duty? Well, that problem rears its ugly head with Ramsay Bolton in a much larger stage later in the book. Slynt just makes it easy here. He goes, you just really can't refuse a direct order in any military style organization I've ever heard of, with the rare exception of an order being illegal or unconstitutional. That there are provisions for that in most militaries, but that's not a thing here. Slynt has no sort of exception he can stand on. He just flat out doesn't wanna. This is the start of difficult judgment calls for Jon in this book that will lead to his choices being severely reprimanded and severely questioned. Even by us readers. We're sitting here, I don't know if Jon made the right call there, or I don't know if Jon handled it right. Like, maybe the decision is right, but the execution isn't right. And execution, I don't mean execution as in killing, I mean going forward with the plan. And it's the same with Daenerys, and it's the same with Bran, where the choices, the moral conundrums get harder and harder the deeper they go in this book, and it's probably going to continue for the rest of their arcs, if not for the rest of their books entirely. These leadership decisions keep getting more difficult. For Dany, she's like, okay, well, how am I going I have to kill to stop more killings. Well, how is, where's the ethical center in that? Jon, same thing. He's got to execute his own brothers, or he's got to do things like make alliances with the wildlings who have been their enemy for thousands of years. These are unprecedented types of decisions that need to be made. And, well, the people who aren't in the leadership position don't see all that nuance and how difficult these choices are. But this is so easy. This is why George is building up. Slint made it as easy as possible. Just obey a direct order. The moral conundrumness of it all is removed. Just, okay, well, this guy's a traitor. I can execute him and no one can really argue because his crime is that blatant. Like, Slint for a second's like, puts his hand on his sword, thinks about it, and is like, all right, never mind, go ahead. When Slint shows up, it's very provocative. Jon is literally greets him with naked steel, naked Valyrian steel, in fact, and thinks about cutting his head off and how it would become somewhat pleasant. But to Jon's credit, he doesn't do that until Slint flat out makes it. There's really no other choice. And Jon doesn't go straight to the execution. He gives him a night to sleep on it. You can't really say Jon just rushed into it. So I give Jon a lot of credit there. Slint just threw it in his face. Jon still was patient, didn't yell, didn't lose his cool, just acted like a leader, and Jaina Slint acted like a child. Nina also writes, the cleaning Longclaw not only is this sign of hostility from an old Northern social tradition there, but it's straight up foreshadowing for the end of the chapter that he's, well, I am going to kill this guy. And it's also a sign of his setting aside the trappings of power, something that's a more important concept we talked about last chapter and is going to continue to rise in importance. Doing it himself is very Northern, but it's also not the trappings of power. Having someone else do that would be exercising his power. Nina writes how this is also a bit of an inverse of A Storm of Swords, where Jon refuses to kill the old man. He just couldn't do it. That old man had done nothing wrong, even though the man was going to die anyway, even though it would blow up Jon's whole subterfuge, even though Jon himself would be put at risk. He just could not do it. And here, though, well, this guy clearly did it. This is the opposite. There is no argument about that old man's crime. Here, it's just the most blatantly obvious crime. And it's also similar to Robb's moment with the Great Jon. You can't have loud, powerful sub-commanders just openly questioning your authority, calling you boy, things like that. And, well, there was a lot less talking about Robb as a boy when Grey Wind bit off two of Great Jon's fingers. So severing two fingers is a little lower impact than severing a head, but Great Jon wasn't a straight-up traitor. So he was just talking. Slint is, an active plotter, would have done stuff to Jon. He would have, given the chance, he might have killed Jon. We can feel pretty confident in that. So that's pretty cool. There's a lot more parallels here, too, though. It's interesting. I find it funny that Lord Slint was Lord of Harrenhal and was going to be in charge of Greyguard, two different old ruined castles that he never went to. He never saw either of them. I like how Jon and Tyrion's old connection, which almost certainly will become a connection again. It was probably a setup when they met really early on in the series. They both have this moment with Janos Slint when Tyrion is almost only a few minutes away from sending Slint to the wall. He starts insulting him and asking questions, and he's like, brings up his sons, and Slint says, "What are my sons to you, dwarf?" And here he says, "You can stick your order up your bastard's arse." It's very similar, just flagrant insubordination. Also, quite ironically, I wonder if George, I did not mean that to be a pun, but it is now that I'm seeing it. I don't know if George did this on purpose. I suspect he did, but it could be a coincidence. Who is the man that seizes Janos Slint at King's Landing when he's trying to leave Tyrion? It's Sir Jacelyn Bywater, a.k.a. Iron Hand. And here, who is it that seizes him and drags him out of the cage? Iron Emmett. So we got some, again, irony. Yes. And of course he does the same thing when he's threatened here. He yells about who his powerful friends are. And it's funny how he can't say the same names he said before, because he can't go, Tywin's my friend, when he's talking to Tyrion. Because Tyrion literally invoked his father's name to threaten Slynt. So he couldn't exactly bring up Tywin, but he still brings up Tyrion's family. He just says, Joffrey and the Queen are my friends. You can't do this. Here he yells out that Tywin is his friend. Tywin would never allow this. That's ironic, too, because Tywin is quite dead. So, yeah, Tywin isn't going to do anything for you, my man. This was... a lot of people cite the Sansa line, including myself, cite the Sansa line where she wishes someone would throw Janos Slynt down and some hero would chop off his head. Now, that does happen here. Now, this chapter was originally written in 2000. When it was originally written, it was read aloud at Technicon in 2008. And originally it was hanging. He really originally was hanged. And later it was switched to the sword beheading. Some people say that this is evidence that it wasn't intended to be foreshadowing from Sansa. I don't think that's the case. I don't know that it was foreshadowing. It may have just worked out that way. But I think it's entirely possible George realized he had set that line with Sansa, and changed it so that those two things would line up, so that it did become foreshadowing. This is good argument that it wasn't planned that way, but that doesn't mean George can't go, oh, wait, I could connect these dots, and now it works, and now it fits quite nicely. So nothing wrong, nothing against that possibility at all. Joe writes, Janos Slynt being dragged forward like a child is cowardice on show for the world. He tries more defiance, and then the strength is gone. He's begging, and Jon has a choice. Except he doesn't. Turning back now would be worse than letting him off in the first place. If he wants to kill the boy and let the man be born, he must do this as the first man in his life, Eddard Stark, would have done. That is a great lead-in to something else Nina noticed about these chapters. There's a lot of choosing by not choosing here. There's a lot of going with the default, you could say. It's the same thing Lord Borrell does. Lord Borrell doesn't choose to ransom Davos or hang him. He just is like, well, you were never here. And in this case, Jon decides all these options with Janos Slynt are all worse than just going forward with the obvious. Execute the man for his treason. There's no better choice there. Just do the obvious. And in the case of later in our series of chapters today, well, we have Melisandre arguing that everyone has to make this choice, and Mance had to make this choice and all this, but a lot of it is actually deception, because that wasn't really Mance. So, Joe writes, is this vengeance for Janos Slynt when Jon kills him? Yes, it is. But is it justice? Also, yes. And that's why the conundrum is removed. That's why it's so easy. That's why this is a good start to escalating moral difficulties. This, of course, is also reminiscent of Ned executing Garrett, the Night's Watch deserter. Now, he didn't have a whole lot of choice there, given what he knew. But we as readers knew that there were more circumstances. That Garrett really did see the others. That he wasn't mad because he just cracked, but because he saw something that shouldn't be. So that's really, but that, of course, Janos Slynt has no such excuse. But still, it's reminiscent of that first scene. And Ned and Jon Snow have an awful lot in common. Beyond that. You know who else likes justice is Stannis. He gets that nod of approval at the end, and that is pretty important to showing that they're eye to eye on a lot of issues. That when Jon stands up to Stannis, well, it's a matter of respect, not a matter of disagreement so much. I mean, it is a matter of disagreement, but it's respectful disagreement. And, well, Jon Snow, Lord Commander, basking in the example of Eddard Stark and getting justice at the same time. Janos Slynt, bad man, good riddance. The Dragonsteel point here is important. It's reminiscent of what we pointed out at the time in the Game of Thrones prologue. The quote was, "The other halted. Will saw its eyes, blue, deeper and bluer than any human eyes, a blue that burned like ice. They fixed on the longsword, trembling on high, watched the moonlight running cold along the metal." She agrees, Nina does, that Dragonsteel is Valyrian steel. So do I. I believe Joe does as well. And like I said, we pointed out at the time the other was looking at the sword, maybe to see if it was Valyrian steel. And Nina points to the specific rippling of the blade that is known to be particularly outstanding on Valyrian steel. That might be what they were looking for. Meaning the clue that it was Valyrian steel would be those ripples. They may be able to tell from some other means by the color or something like that. But this is another little bit of parallel storytelling. The concept of dragon steel is raised in the Tyrion chapters as they go along the Valyrian roads, which are nicknamed dragon roads. So you've got Valyrian steel, is it dragon steel? And you've got Valyrian roads, dragon roads. So it's a pretty straightforward connection to call them that. So I don't think there's any great mystery in the naming. The mystery is, well, there's plenty of other mysteries, but I do think this is the same concept. Maybe it's not, maybe it's indication that the technology existed before Valyria, but I think it's just a nickname for the same process. With that, we can bring up the Jade Compendium. Aemon mentions he wants Jon to read that a bit of that. We'll talk about that more when we actually get to it, because Jon will actually look through the book. But just to bring it up here, and maybe we'll have a couple of notes on it throughout the rest of this chapter. One other theme that's really omnipresent in these early chapters is Jon sending off his friends because he knows he can trust them. While Melisandre's like, you need to keep some of your friends around you. This character Giant is a good example here. We have this veteran who has this inverse nickname. He's a very small man, but he has the name Giant. And he's loyal, good at what he does. And it leads into, that loyalty is why Jon trusts him, but it leads into Giant saying, look, man, this is a good idea, I guess, to be watching the wall more widely, but that's about all we can do is watch. If they come with any sort of strength, yeah, a man on top of the wall is worth 100 below, but they might come with 1,000, and there's only 30 of us. So that still leaves them well short. And Raymond Redbeard is the pivot story from this, because that is apparently what Raymond Redbeard did. He got his foothold on the wall. He found a spot along the vast length of the wall that was not well patrolled, brought a bunch of climbers, and then started building defenses once he got on top of the wall. Like, built like a barricade on either side of where they'd climbed up so the Night's Watch couldn't approach them. And then they set up like a big stair almost to walk people over, and that's how they got a whole army across. Pretty clever, actually. And, well, now they're worried about something like that happening again because the issue has been raised. Raymond Redbeard was killed by Lord Willem, who was Jon's grandfather's grandfather. Now, that's still true, even if Jon is not Ned's son, because, Lyanna is Ned's sister, so it's the same family tree. Artos the Implacable is mentioned here, and, well, Artos has some possible vibes for Jon himself. Artos ruled in Willem's place as a regent of sorts. He does have a statue, but he was never lord. His son, Lord Willem's son, Edwyle, which is Jon's great-grandfather and Ned's grandfather, was only a baby, so that's why we had a regent situation. But this implacable, strong-willed, powerful warrior Stark figure really sounds like where Jon's headed, because of all these theories about what he'll be like as a resurrected person. Plus, what we see in this scene, he's just doesn't seem to have this compassion. He's just so blunt and brutal with his methods here. And of course, we talk about this stuff more in our Crypts of Winterfell episode, and we go through all these different characters that are buried down there. We talk about the statues, Lord Willem, and all these other Stark characters, including Artos, are mentioned there. Okay. Nina with a really nice small take here, pointing to the fact that Sam wishes he could put Ulmer's stories in a book. He really is the George of the series. He's just showing himself to be the George when he makes comments like that. It's true. And it's true. It really would be nice if those stories, we could just have all these other characters' life stories. What a wealth of embarrassment of riches that would be, wouldn't it? A little bit of irony here too. I wonder about this. Here's a quote about the Lord of Bones and Craster.
That Lord of Bones, he's to be spared. Craster always swore he'd kill him if he ever showed his face about the keep. Mance never did half the things he done.
So that's funny because basically the complaint here is that why is Mance getting executed and Rattleshirt being let to live? well, and it's pointed out that the curiosity here is that Craster would kill Rattleshirt if he ever showed his face around the keep. So Rattleshirt was that so bad that even Craster hated him. That's really saying something. Super chat from John Webster Film. Thank you guys, as always, for your fantastic analysis. Loving A Dance with Dragons, Valar Rereadis. Shea is the best, and you're pretty cool too, Aziz. Thank you. I do agree that Ashea is better than me. And yeah, thanks a lot, John. Check out John Webster's channel. Ashea has done a guest appearance on his channel, and that is the name of it, John Webster Film. Amy Blackfyre super chat says, "Can we get a birthday shout out for Brandon Winslow? His name day is tomorrow." Oh, absolutely! Happy name day / birthday, Brand Winslow. Check out Brand's art. He's been posting it to Twitter. He's been doing 3D art of A Song of Ice and Fire stuff. The one that comes to mind, he's done several. The one that really stands out is the version of Queen's Crown he did, which has the reflection of the lake. That's where Bran and Hodor and Mira and Jojen and Summer were, with that lake in the Tower House. So yeah, happy name day, Bran. Dornish Dame says, and Gilly bends the knee to Jon, only for him to say that is only for kings. Great point. Yeah, only for kings. Jon is a king. I missed that. That's a really good one. And she also says Oswell was on bended knee outside the Tower of Joy in Ned's fever dream, sharpening his sword, but sort of like taking a knee for the birth of the king that had just happened upstairs via Lyanna. That's pretty cool. Flick commenters, Facebook commenters, a lot of people were talking about the books, meaning all the stuff in the library. Now, I didn't talk about it very much here because we did talk about it a lot in the Sam chapter where the books were a little more prominent. And we will have more time to talk about books later. Like I said, the Jade Compendium when Jon actually reads that. And of course, we're looking forward to more book stuff when we get to more Citadel chapters in the Winds of Winter. Guinevere Greenstones asks, are we sure the baby swap actually happened? Is there a chance that it was reversed, something like that? Yes, we're sure it happened because of what I said earlier about Val. Val has taken a liking to the children, and she noticed, I'm not sure if she noticed or Jon told her, but she definitely knows. She said she likes Craster's son when she's holding the kid that everyone is told is Dalla's baby. So and then she goes on to say she's pretty sure Melisandre knows about the swap too. So yeah, we can be pretty darn sure it actually happened. Nina reminds us to bring that the Accursed King series by Maurice Druon, something we bring up every once in a while as one of the probably top 3 influences on A Song of Ice and Fire. Who knows top 3 if that's really true, but I rate it that high. There's many parallels.
Doubt it's top 5.
Yeah, it's definitely top 5 if it's not top 3. If it's not top 3, it's 4 or 5. That's basically what we're saying. And there's a baby swap in it. So there you go. That's part of one of the many, many parallels here. And that's something that's kind of fun. So the possibility suggested in this series, which is a historical fiction, is that this baby swap may have really happened. We don't know that it did, but the author, Maurice Druon, goes into the possibility, and it's somewhat compelling. Dornish Dame also says, I feel like Benjen joined the Night's Watch as a self-imposed penance for not protecting / saving Lyanna. Ned's penance for the same guilt is raising Jon, a daily living reminder of Lyanna. That is a theory that's been out there for a long time, and I absolutely agree that it deserves mention here. Good job, Dornish Dame. And that might, in fact, be... so we might be getting a third version of that. That's carried forward, this penance of that. Girl
I
Nettles.
also, real quick, think it's worth mentioning, actually, that Benjen was like 16 when he joined the Night's Watch, and of course, that's how old Jon is.
Oh, was that right? I thought Benjen was a little bit younger. But anyway, they're close in age. So yeah, you're right. That's a great point. Girl Nettle says he should have let Gilly take both babes. Jon is pretty sure that Melisandre wouldn't have allowed that. They would have come after her. But later, with Val's take, she doesn't necessarily think that. She's like, I don't know about that. I don't know that she really cares that much. So, yeah, maybe Jon was taking a risk that could have taken that risk. Maybe he saw it as too much of a risk when it really wasn't that big of a risk. In general, whether or not Gilly could have taken both babes, this general idea that maybe there's another way to handle this, I agree with that. Maybe the baby swap might not have been the only solution here. Okay, moving on. Tyrion 3, Blackfyres assemble. AKA the gang meets duck and egg. While his last chapter, Tyrion 2, was all about foreshadowing and intrigue through dialogue and world building, this one also has foreshadowing and intrigue, but it's shown through in-world historical parallels more so than other things. From Tyrion's history to Blackfyre history to Dance of the Dragons history to ancient history. In that, I refer to the tale of Serwyn of the Mirror Shield and Sir Byron Swan, who was trying to recreate a legend. He was burned to death in the attempt. You can't copy a dragon. And that's a theme of the whole Blackfyre arc. Varys and Illyrio's arc, I think, is going to come down to that. There's no substitute for a real dragon. And it's brilliantly presented here that with that tale of Serwyn and Euryx of the mirror image is not a good enough thing. A copy is not good enough. It's really, really awesome. I love this chapter. Now, you can't copy a dragon, but you can dream of one, as Tyrion did in the last chapter. In this one, his knowledge of them is extremely important. But he's still drinking heavily, of course, so he starts the chapter off a little behind.
He woke alone and found the litter halted.
That said, though, he doesn't seem hungover, and since he's just woken up, that's actually significant. He's sober because he's just woken up. And he stays sober the whole chapter. That's interesting. We've been really paying attention to his alcohol intake, so it kind of stood out to me that he has none this whole chapter. And I think he's a little more clear. I think he's got a little more clarity. There's still a lot of things he misses. There's a lot of subtle stuff in this chapter that an attentive reader like myself missed many times going through this book, that only 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th times or reading someone else's takes got me to some of these places. But yeah, there's a lot here. And I think it's interesting that he's alcohol free for at least one chapter. He does think of drinking at one point in this chapter, after thinking of his father, thinking, "Whoa, I need to wash that taste away." The taste of his dad. The first of the past events used as foreshadowing I'll highlight in this chapter is from that same anecdote that makes him want to have a drink, which is the cleaning of the drains and cisterns, which was Tyrion's gift from his father upon his 16th name day. I mean, really, you have the richest dad in the whole country, and that's what you get for your 16th is drain duty? No wonder he hates his dad. I mean, really. But that's not the most relevant part. This is the thing we should be looking at here, I think. Well, not should be. One of the things we should be looking at here is that knowledge might prove useful later when taking Casterly Rock, that castle which has never been taken, except for maybe Lan the Clever, who took it maybe so long ago. The drains and cisterns were crucial in the TV show in that regard as well. But it was a theory well before the TV show had that scene, well before the TV show even existed. People were suspecting that this drains and cisterns stuff was going to be relevant, because this isn't the first time Tyrion mentions it. There's also a relevant tale, again, relating to Lan the Clever, as told to us in The World of Ice and Fire. Quote.
Cat crossing.
Xerxes can read the quote for us.
All right. In the most common version of the tale, Lan discovered a secret way inside the rock, a cleft so narrow that he had to strip off his clothes and coat himself in butter in order to squeeze through. Once inside, however, he began to work his mischief.
More irony from Tywin. We've been through so much hypocrisy and irony from Tywin. He was worried that Tyrion would bring shame down on House Lannister. That's why he gave him this job. So instead of shame, Casterly Rock's going to fall for the first time ever. So that's what you're going to get from giving this gift to your son. Instead of him embarrassing you in the Free Cities, he's going to cause your castle to fall for the first time ever. Ha. So that's a pretty much the opposite of Tywin's intent there. But it doesn't end there. We never run out of examples of Tywin saying things that are the opposite of true. This one isn't a lie. This is his sincere belief just being wrong and it blowing up in his face a bit. George, I think, likes to do that. Have Tywin say the opposite of the truth while having him believe it. Commenter Sophia Garmiri pointed to this, which was Tyrion's request to tour the Free Cities. Tywin's response was, my brothers could be relied upon to bring no shame upon House Lannister. Because Tyrion was like, look, your brothers all went, why can't I go? He said, since neither ever wed a whore. Nina was ready with the answer for this one. This is really funny. We're pretty sure that Jerian was the original husband of the sailor's wife and the father of Lana, which we detailed at the time, and we'll be seeing that firsthand when we go. We have that chapter with Jorah. So, quite literally, he did marry a whore. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with marrying a sex worker, but it's Tywin's hypocrisy here is the issue. And of course, his other brother, Tyget, died of a pox. Most of the time when we're presented with a pox in this story, it's because of going to a brothel. That is the pattern that we've seen. It's not every time. So it's entirely possible that both of his brothers... Well, anyway. We've all gotten quite used to Tywin's irony and hypocrisy by now. Here's what I mean about Serwyn and Urax, however you want to say it. I say Urax, and you'll see why in a second. And how it's a parallel to what's happening here. It starts off with a little word play to set up the joke. And this is only something I caught because I read and listen. Not usually at the same time, but sometimes at the same time. But I read and listen to every chapter multiple times, and this was an audio clue.
He turned to Magister Illyrio.
Are these two known to you, Magister? They look like outlaws. Should I find my axe?
Your axe?
Your axe? Nice. Good one, George. The story itself is simple enough. Serwyn used a shiny shield so that a dragon saw their own reflection instead of a dude. That tale applies to a huge number of different stories. George loves to invert the meaning of a dragon and play with this theme. We outlined many of these examples in our episode called Serwyn of the Mirror Shield. For example, the tale of Eric and Arik, one of the twins dresses as the other to get close to a dragon queen, Rhaenyra. It ends in tragedy, as the story always does in all variations, except for the original. Only Serwyn actually succeeded. Even whether it was the literal slaying of a dragon with a mirror shield or all these variations like Eric and Arik or young Griff pretending to be a dragon, they always end in tragedy. I think that's part of one of the main themes here is you can't fool a dragon so easily. And who's the dragon going to be this time? Not a literal dragon, but Daenerys. She's the dragon that has to be convinced. And I don't know a single loud voice in the fandom that thinks Daenerys and young Griff are going to marry. So it's kind of like he's trying to get close to her, pretending he's a dragon, holding that shield up. And that shield, that reflection was given to him by Varys and Illyrio. He sincerely believes it. John Connington sincerely believes it. But what is the lesson of young Griff? What did we just learn? In in Jon's chapters, the brilliance of Stannis' sword is described as a reflection. Because it's not really Lightbringer. The same literary clue is used here. Stannis' Lightbringer is a counterfeit, a reflection of the real thing. Just like Sir Byron Swan wasn't really a dragon. He was a dude with a reflective shield. Just like Stannis' sword isn't a Lightbringer. This kid is not a Targaryen. He's not a real dragon. What we have in young Griff is a Blackfyre. I very strongly believe this. The more I go through this, the more solid this theory becomes. Of all the Westerosi anecdotes George R. R. Martin would have Haldon test Tyrion on, it's the one where a man pretending to be a dragon tries to get close to a real dragon and fails. Yeah. Dany was told a long while back that she'd be the slayer of lies, that she'd be dealing with a mummer's dragon. That's a brilliant piece of writing. Varys is both a mummer and it's his dragon, and this is a mummer's dragon because it's a false dragon, so it's a double meaning. Maybe you could even squeeze 3 or 4 meanings out of that, probably too. Now, more of the meat of this chapter described by our title, and like I said, would be delivered through these historical parallels. Well, that's an ancient historical parallel, and then one from the Dance of the Dragons that was a replay of it. Egg in the Dunk and Egg tales is Aegon, later Aegon the Fifth. If this Aegon is going to be king, he'll be Aegon the Sixth. Aegon the Fifth shaved his head to conceal his identity, and he wears a straw hat. He doesn't live at court like a typical prince, but out in the world, sleeping in ditches and eating meager fare. He squires for a big knight named Dunk, who much later joins his Kingsguard. His sigil is a shooting star over a field with a tree. Now here we meet young Griff, quote,
Tyrion craned his head to one side and saw a boy standing on the roof of a low wooden building, waving a wide-brimmed straw hat. He was a lithe, and well-made youth, with a lanky build and a shock of dark blue hair. The dwarf put his age at 15, 16, or near enough to make no matter.
So instead of shaving his head, he dyes his hair blue. He does wear a floppy straw hat, just like Egg. Instead of Dunk, we have Duck, a knight whose sigil is a single duck over a field instead of a falling star. And he will be Aegon's first Kingsguard as well, later in the book. His upbringing, as Varys later tells a dying Kevin, is one that has an element of struggle. He's also eaten meager fare, slept on a pole boat. I think you see where I'm going with this. Here's more. Quote,
Blue hair may serve you well in Tyrosh, but in Westeros, children will throw stones at you and girls will laugh in your face. The lad was taken aback.
My mother was a lady of Tyrosh. I dyed my hair in memory of her. 2 points there. Tyrion's take on Westeros and being judgmental towards looks they're unfamiliar with is ominous in light of both the Golden Company and Daenerys' coalition army. Point being, between those two armies and other forces that may come along too, there's a lot of things way more unfamiliar than a blue-haired boy. I mean, we've seen green-haired girls in Westeros, so Westeros is xenophobic is the point, and a lot of different looks and styles and smells and languages will carry with it some tension and mistrust. More to the point here, the blue hair helps conceal his purplish eyes, making them look more blue. And most importantly, the first ever lady of House Blackfyre, the Grand Matriarch, the mother of Black Dragons, wife to Daemon, was Rohan of Tyrosh. She had 7 sons and multiple daughters. Now here's where we get a little meta. In Tyrion 2, this stuff happened originally. When George wrote this chapter back in whenever he wrote it, it was read aloud in 2005. And it was originally Tyrion 2, not Tyrion 3, so the story expanded. Now here is that version of this quote.
Illyrio says he wants to give young Griff his blessings and has a gift for him in the chests. Haldon tells him there is no time for the litter. Illyrio gets angry and says there are things Griff must know. The Golden Company has broken its contact with Myr and is riding west from the disputed lands. Haldon interrupts him by saying they already know this because Benero has seen it in his fires and that the Golden Company makes for Volantis. That is why Griff needs them to make haste, Illyrio says. The dragon has 3 heads. There is no need for haste. Haldon says Griff believes there is need for haste. Haldon eyes Tyrion and then begins to speak in another language. Tyrion cannot tell what it is, but thinks it might be Volantene. He catches a few words that come close to High Valyrian. The words he catches are Queen, dragon, and sword.
So that was changed. That was changed, taken away. It was removed, that reference to the sword in particular. I remember this at the time. It was a big point of theorizing. The boards on Westeros.org really honed in on that mention of a sword, and the overwhelmingly popular choice was that it was Blackfyre. They're talking about giving Blackfyre the sword to Aegon to really seal his identity, to really show Westeros that he is who he says he is, while also very much suggesting to the clever and in tune reader that he's actually a Blackfyre and not a Targaryen. Of course, yes, Blackfyres are Targaryens in their own way, but still, you get what I mean. So that's pretty cool. I guess that the follow-up theory, which I also agree with and was an early adopter of myself, was that George decided that was too obvious. It would be caught. I mean, we caught it when it wasn't even in a published chapter, assuming that we were right, because that was an accounting of the reading, not the word for word text that George read. So, very strong evidence there as well. But moving on, I really like how Tyrion answers Griff's question about being useful. It's a reminder that he's sober and has this clarity here. Connington is hateful towards Lannisters because of, well, Tywin is someone that beat him and replaced him. Rather, he replaced Tywin, and then Tywin came back around to replace him in the next regime. So he has a lot of, he just has a lot of hatred, period. But he really doesn't like Lannisters. And, well, his first take is fair. He says, why would the queen want a Lannister when a Lannister killed her father? It's a reasonable question. But Tyrion, like I said, he's really good. He gives a really good answer here. And it's hard to argue with. Quote,
I can tell her grace how my sweet sister thinks, if you call it thinking. I can tell her captains the best way to defeat my brother Jaime in battle. I know which lords are brave, and which are craven, which are loyal, and which are venal. I can deliver allies to her. And I know much and more of dragons, as your half-maester will tell you. I'm amusing too, and I don't eat much. Consider me your own true imp.
Griff's response to this is similar to Ned Stark's when pressed on the issue of keeping the direwolves. He never actually says, okay, fine, you can keep the wolves or anything like that. He just immediately launches into the rules, the conditions under which they're to be kept. That's what happens here. And it's also similar to like Jon Snow telling Ned that the god sent the wolves. He's like, can't really argue with that. Connington has to admit those are darn good reasons for Dany to make good use of him. He's like, okay, dragon knowledge of lords and who's brave and who's craven. All right, that is actually quite useful. But Connington never says, okay. He just says, all right, you get to sleep there. You're the least important member of the company. But it's a yes. It is a yes. It's a mean, rude yes, but it is a yes. The same thing happens in Dunk and Egg, too. When Sir Duncan confronts Egg's father, Maekar, about how it would be better for Egg to be out roughing it, to have a little struggle in his life, versus being pampered, like most royals are, Maekar just grinds his jaw like Stannis and stomps off. But the next morning, Egg shows up, saddled, ready to go, out roughing it. So it was a acceptance, a begrudging yes, without ever verbalizing the yes. The one thing Tyrion very slightly bonds with Jon Connington for a half a second comes right here. Quote,
I understand hate well enough. From the way Griff said the word, Tyrion knew that much was true. He has supped on hate himself, this one. It has warmed him in the night for years.
A bad sign for a motivator, isn't it? Hate that's held on to for that long time, well, what does that do? It makes you bitter. I'd like to point out that I originally wrote butter in the document right there because of the whole butter Casterly Rock anecdote, and that is just not a very good delivery. You know, you're like building up the suspense. It makes you that much anger. It makes you butter. So let's talk about bitterness and Jon Connington. One thing I can't quite figure out is the symbolism of the red wolfskin pelt he wears. Maybe because he's restless. Wolves are described as restless a lot of times, but I'm not really sure. weigh in. If you've got a symbolic take on that, let me know. Nina says maybe the further underlining of his actually red hair. He's hiding his red hair, but this is maybe a sign that he's red underneath that. Much is the same griff he chose, all to obviously emphasize that he's Jon Connington. He didn't really try that hard with his disguise, in other words. I mean, Griff, Lord of Griffin's Roost, it's not that sneaky. And Nina also writes, maybe it's symbolic representation of the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. Jon Connington is the lone wolf. Even though he's with this group, his personal hatred is not shared by the rest of the group. Young Aegon isn't a hateful, vindictive guy. Duck, he didn't like that Caswell kid, but he's not vindictive towards him. He hasn't lived on anger all his time. Halden doesn't seem like a super nice guy, but he doesn't seem like he's ultra bitter either. So I do think he's kind of alone in that sense. And so that's a pretty good take by Nina. I'm curious what the rest of you have to say about it, if anything. His historical parallel here is very straightforward. I've said it before. If you've never thought about it or heard me talk about it, once you hear it, I think you'll agree. It's Bittersteel, a.k.a. Aegor Rivers, one of the great bastards of Aegon IV, half-brother to Daemon Blackfyre, husband to Daemon's eldest daughter, Calla. We have a full episode devoted to him. I think it's the 5th one in our Blackfyre series. It might be the 4th. The Golden Company episode might be the 5th. We have separate ones on the Golden Company and on Bittersteel. Like Connington, Bittersteel was a very serious man. The nickname was not incidental. It was very well earned. Bittersteel was stinted compared to his great bastard half-brothers. For example, they both got Valyrian steel through their family. He did not. That's not fair, right? Bittersteel fled in exile after being on the losing side of a key battle. The first Blackfyre rebellion, the Redgrass Field. Connington was exiled by Aerys after losing the Battle of the Bells. Bittersteel was the top guardian for the surviving Blackfyre heirs until his own death. And that's pretty much the same here for Jon Connington, except it's just the one kid, and Connington doesn't know he's Blackfyre, but still pretty similar. Bittersteel formed the Golden Company and invaded Westeros with them and a Blackfyre claimant twice. And here comes Jon Connington, ready to bring them over to Westeros for a Blackfyre pretender yet again. The span of exile for them is similarly long too. It was just under, it's going to be just under 20 years for Connington and just over 20 for Bittersteel, maybe 22, 23. Oh, and who had a key hand in foiling both the 3rd and 4th Blackfyre rebellions? Aegon Targaryen, not Aegon VI, the young Griff, obviously, but he wasn't alive that long ago. But Aeg, who was cited as a major factor in the 3rd, as a prince at that point, of course, as a warrior and presumably a leader of sorts. And Duncan the Tall himself slew the Blackfyre pretender Daemon III in the 4th Blackfyre rebellion. So the parallels are like parallel to each other here. This is just a parallel party. I think I'm saying that word too much, but it does fit rather well quite a lot in this chapter and fairly often in George R. R. Martin's writing overall. Especially if you listen to History of Westeros podcast, we probably spend more effort on raising those points than anyone. We expect that Bittersteel is planned to appear in a future Dunk and Egg story too, given those events. I mean, the 3rd Blackfyre Rebellion takes place 7 years after the latest Dunk and Egg book, Mystery Knight. So there's always a chance before that too. We don't have to go all the way 7 years there to see that potential appearance of Bittersteel. And if we do actually see Bittersteel on page, I expect we'll notice a few more things he has in common with Connington. That should be it's pretty straightforward. So Tyrion figures it out, though. Like we said, this Griff nickname, he's not really, his roots are showing. He's not really hiding it that much because most people just aren't even going to know who he is. He's been in exile so long, he's been forgotten. But Tyrion is far more knowledgeable and aware of such things. And he lets him know that he knows in this quote here. What if we should find the queen and discover that this talk of dragons was just some sailor's drunken fancy? This wide world is full of such mad tales. Grumpkins and snarks, ghosts and ghouls, mermaids, rock goblins, winged horses, winged pigs, winged lions. The winged lion, of course, that's him saying, I know who you are, because that's a griffin. But this is also similar to Tyrion's skepticism at the Wall. In both cases, we know he's wrong. We saw the others when Tyrion's being skeptical, and we've certainly seen the dragons. But this is also a subtle reference to Bittersteel yet again. Winged horse, he says. Rock goblins, winged horses, winged pigs, winged lions. Winged horse is Bittersteel's sigil with fire-breathing winged horse. And I cannot think of another winged horse in the series. There might be one, but I just can't think of one. So that's pretty straightforward. By the way, winged pig is also a sigil. It's Clayton Suggs' sigil of all people. He's one of the Queen's men under Stannis. He's terrible. Also, he's named after a football player.
You know, when pigs fly.
Yeah. So we will have more chances to make this comparison of Bittersteel to Connington when we're actually in Connington's head. And certainly we'll see a lot more of his anger and bitterness from that perspective. But we'll also see some other things. He's going to, in fact, take a look directly in Bittersteel's golden eyes and not realize how much of a mirror it is. Tyrion's own read is strong and negative on Connington. He does not have a good feeling about this guy, and neither do I. And it's his eyes that really tell the story.
They were ice blue, pale, cold. The dwarf misliked pale eyes. Lord Tywin's eyes had been pale green and flecked with gold.
And that didn't work out either. I mean, yeah, Tywin and Connington have some things in common with their harshness, their ruthlessness. Certainly Connington is nowhere near as bad as Tywin. But he is perhaps capable of doing as much damage, depending on how things go. But I also think that's a bit of an allusion to the others. I mean, ice blue, pale, cold. If you were to hear that sentence in a vacuum and think A Song of Ice and Fire, I think that's the first thing you would think of is the others. And of course, there's no straightforward connection of Jon Connington to the others. So what I think maybe if that's the suggestion here is it's symbolic of him doing the others' work for them and bringing civil war and disease to Westeros, which should make it a lot weaker. All that death and destruction could make the long night worse. Tyrion, of course, doesn't notice that. He's more focused on this connection to his father, nor could he possibly take note of the fact that Jon Connington is gay. There's no clues to his sexuality in this chapter. We get them in his head, not outside of them so much. We find out he was quite in love with Rhaegar when we get in his POV. He thinks of him as his silver prince. That's not a that's not a casual affection there. I note it here because it's crucial as his motivation. One that Varys and Illyrio are very much leveraging and counting on. Connington, his love for Rhaegar, that lost love, that unrequited, unfulfilled love, is causing him to be very determined in doing well by that man's son. He really wants Rhaegar's son to get the throne back, in memory of this man he loved. Daenerys questioned the bones, the sheep bone, or the child's bones, that she thought maybe those are sheep bones. Ultimately, she decided she was not being deceived, and I think she's correct in that estimation. Jon Snow had no reason to question the idea that Mance isn't really Mance in that chapter coming up. And here, Connington could have a reason to suspect Varys and Illyrio are presenting him with a false Rhaegar's son, but it's one of these things that he really wants to believe, and maybe it never crossed his mind. Maybe he just didn't think, are they deceiving me? It may not have crossed his mind, but he doesn't want to think about that, even if someone brings it up. So it'll be an interesting point of conflict for him if somehow proof emerges that that's not Rhaegar's kid, or, man, what will he do if that happens, if he discovers the truth of that? And this is, of course, goes back to things Illyrio was saying about Tyrion and why he's not just a common sellsword, why you can actually trust him. Well, maybe you can't actually trust him, but you can trust this aspect of him. You can trust that he really does legitimately care about Rhaegar's legacy and Rhaegar's son, at least this person he thinks is Rhaegar's son. So, at the time, Illyrio said young Griff is someone he dotes on, which is, he just calls him his son like that. It's his very affectionate. And here's where we get to the evidence that Illyrio is the father of young Griff and not Rhaegar.
There is a gift for the boy in one of the chests. Some candied ginger. He was always fond of it. Illyrio sounded oddly sad. I thought I might continue on to Goyen Dro with you. A farewell feast before you start downriver.
We have no time for feasts, my lord,
said Halden.
So very striking. Nina and Joe both wrote takes on this, and so did I. So let's go through these. They all catch the same sort of odd affection for Aegon. He's as tall as Griff now, which means he hasn't seen him in a while. That's a report. He's very interested in the kid. It makes sense that he would be interested in their prince, their manufactured prince. But this is personal. It's not just how's his swordsmanship, how's his education, how's his, like, is he tough? Is he right? Like, those are the things you would ask about your promised king or your manufactured king. But these are more personal questions. He brings him candy and says he really liked this candy. His shoulders slump. This is the note that he's oddly sad. It's nostalgic, right? Yeah, of course, this kid lived with him, so maybe he just got attached to him. But really, with the eye color being blue, Sarah's eyes being blue, Illyrio's got that look from the statue. It really looks like that his genetics were the reason he had the right look to manufacture a Blackfyre-looking kid, a Targaryen / Blackfyre-looking kid. But again, it's just not quite enough. These, as amazing as this facsimile is, it still comes up short. But I'm getting off the topic here. I want to focus on Illyrio's odd sensitivity here. Joe notes a similar thing. He says, "How fares our lad?" And the quote that Ashea just read, Illyrio sucks. Like, Illyrio is over and over, we're told this guy would sell his mother if the price was right. So this is really out of character for him, this sensitivity, this personal interest in a human being, right? Like this compassion, these connections. It's very different than the very cold calculating, like, what kind of money can I get out of this? What kind of value can I get out of a guy who's deep in slavery and land owning and all these just awful corrupt businesses he's in.
And for me, Aziz, it's like the bar is so low for Illyrio
Yeah.
that just this little thing changes my opinion of him so much.
Yeah. He's so bad that it's like, no, he can't really be sensitive. I was like, something else is going on here. And yeah, but I agree with you. I think it is sincere. I think he really does care about this kid, which means that it has to be something like a family connection, because there's no way a dude this crappy would form this kind of sensitivity to a kid that he doesn't have a connection to. So I think it's extremely well done by George that this book had been out for a while, years before this started to be really accepted. People started noticing it right away, but there was a lot of resistance to a lot of this. But now I think we're in a different spot where it's been 10 years and people are like, yeah, we've been sitting on it for a while, had time to think about it. It just, more and more little clues have popped up that people didn't notice initially. And it just, and so little counter evidence. Like, there's just nothing pointing to this kid, in my opinion, legitimately being Rhaegar's son. There's just almost no evidence for that. And so much on the other side. But let's move on to other things that are talked about in this chapter. Nina writes, "This is the first mention of Khal Pono in a very long time. We do know that character. Khal Pono was one of Drogo's co's. He was the first one to leave when Drogo was laid dying. Took 10,000 with him. But here we hear he has 30,000. And apparently we also hear he's intimidating other Khalasars. This is Zeko and Motho are running from him, apparently. So we wonder if that's going to matter. Pono isn't mentioned again in this book. He might be mentioned later. Certainly we see Jocko, who is one of the ones that Dany has a problem with and meets him at the end of the book. So we might yet see Pono next book, but no more on him this book. But it's important to keep track of the Dothraki. They're obviously going to be really important. Daenerys is quite likely going to win them over. And if she brings them with her to Westeros, as we saw on TV, which seems pretty damn likely, it's another example of culture clash that, Dothraki aren't necessarily going to get along with Westerosi or communicate with them even. Yeah, so that could cause some issues. So, and this is potentially related to the slave trade ripples, Joe writes. Like, the Dothraki may be more active because the price of slaves is going up because of so many have been freed. So that is one of those sad but realistic effects on the market, on the slave market that Illyrio was alluding to with Tyrion. And Tyrion was getting very curious about all that. And was like, why is Illyrio helping this person who's destroying the slave trade when he is clearly profiting from the slave trade? So this stuff really wraps into itself. It's super interesting, and I'm curious where a lot of these global political machinations are going to go, because there's so many really big, powerful figures, and how Dany's going to interact with Pentos and the Calls and Illyrio and all these other things, the Volantines. It's super interesting. I can't wait. We're going to discuss Septa Lemore later, because she's barely in this chapter, except I'll at least point out that she's perhaps the most mysterious. She's the member of this group that I have the least, the fewest theories on. So that makes her very curious. Makes me more curious. The less we know, the more we want to know. Halden also is a major curiosity, but I don't know that he has any kind of secret identity or anything that I know of. He doesn't seem like that. He reminds us vaguely of Qyburn, because he's a guy that was apparently kicked out of the Citadel. But it doesn't sound like he was kicked out for being like a sadistic necromancer or something. He seems intelligent, though maybe not as intelligent as he thinks he is. He comes off as a little bit arrogant. Maybe that was his problem. Maybe he's just too much of a know-it-all. Maybe he just couldn't get along with other people. That would be kind of fitting, that these characters, a lot of these Blackfyres, these characters in this party, are just along the same lines. They're just, all of them are kind of poor copies of the originals. Like, this guy is a half-maester, and etc. A little more on that in a minute. He definitely has some capabilities, though. I mean, his education of Aegon, is a full education. He's a broad curriculum, it seems like. He certainly seems to have earned a silver link. He didn't get enough links to be a maester, but apparently saying he didn't get enough links to be a maester means he got some links. And I would guess silver being one of them, since he introduces himself as a healer. He seems to know about grayscale. So Nina thinks he's in exile from the Citadel too. Maybe some sort of reason he had to leave. None of us have great takes on why he had to leave. There's just no information there. In terms of the poor copy theme that's going on here, Nina suggests maybe he's like the version of Marwyn, where Dany gets Marwyn, who's like really well knows all the stuff about dragon lore and prophecies, and well, Aegon just gets Halden Halfmaester, who knows a few things, but he doesn't know. He hasn't been to Ashai and found pages of lost books and done all this other stuff and used glass candles. So yeah, Halden could be like the poor man's Marwyn. I like that idea. And yeah, again, as reminder, as much as I'm saying he's a poor man's Marwyn, he's still quite capable, still very intelligent. So let's not take that too far. He tries to regain the upper hand over Tyrion in their little battle of knowledge. It's like two men butting heads over who's the better know-it-all. And Halden starts telling stories, and it intimidates him a little bit. The first ones don't do anything. He's like, pirates at Dagger Lake and Korra the Cruel, and Tyrion's like, haha, that's funny. But then the Shrouded Lord, that one does spook Tyrion a little bit. Quote,
I beg your pardon, Yolo. You need not look so pale. I was only playing with you. The Prince of Sorrows does not bestow his grey kiss lightly. His grey kiss? The thought made his flesh crawl. Death had lost its terror for Tyrion Lannister, but grayscale was another matter. The Shrouded Lord is just a legend, he told himself, no more real than the ghost of Lan the Clever that some claim haunts Casterly Rock. Even so, he held his tongue.
Here we have an old friend, foreshadowing. We haven't had that in a while, have we? If you haven't been listening to VRR since the start, you might not even know what I mean by foreshadowing. It's a term we coined to indicate foreshadowing something that never actually happens. Now you're saying, perhaps, but Aziz, the grayscale stuff absolutely happens. Yeah, of course it does. I think it's going to be a pretty big plot line. And there's a small chance Tyrion even has it inside him. I am a little dubious of that, in part because of other foreshadowing that seems to indicate he's going to live through everything. My headcanon is Tyrion survives the whole series and writes about it afterwards. But that's another topic. Regardless, we can agree that grayscale is a thing, whether or not it's directly a part of Tyrion's story or just goes elsewhere. The Shrouded Lord, though, does not happen, despite a lot of setup here. And we know we have confidence that this is foreshadowing because George flat out said that he wrote a Shrouded Lord chapter where Tyrion meets the Shrouded Lord, talks to them, and he was really proud of that chapter, which makes it a bummer that he cut it because he said it was a great chapter. He was really proud of how he wrote it, but it just didn't fit anymore. It just didn't fit the story the way he wrote it. And, well, maybe we'll get it as bonus material sometime down the line. I doubt he deleted it, right? So one day it'll be like like DVD extras, deleted scenes, right? So I think we'll still get it one day. All right. Duck. Raleigh Duckfield, it's a very interesting story. Not interesting in that the details are particularly provocative, but he's the one guy that is not shy about telling his story. Everyone else is like keeping their history secret. They have their secrets, but Duck is like, I'll just tell you everything. And it's kind of satisfying. Like we all, kind of like Jon and Janos Slynt, we all kind of, we don't want to revel in violence, right? But when it happens to the worst people, we gotta like shrug a little, or maybe even feel some satisfaction, and maybe we feel a little bit uncomfortable with feeling satisfied at violence. But hey, we're human, and we do like seeing terrible people get punishment because we're just so used to seeing powerful, terrible people escape punishment. So we really are often starved for that form of justice. Rich, snobby, upper class people getting away with things. And that is the story of Duck. Giving it back to someone who held over him. Now, Duck still suffered the consequences. He still had to go into exile. So he didn't, it wasn't a full tale of justice. It was just that dude got his ribs broken and Duck had to run off. So we actually do meet, Nina points out, we actually do meet that Lord Caswell. He was just the heir when Duck ran off, but he appears at Bitterbridge. Actually, Joe and Nina both point that out. And we see him at Bitterbridge in A Clash of Kings when Catelyn sees him. Yeah. During the melee that Brienne won. He's a wispy young man there, so he's definitely didn't grow into anything larger there. Why Harry Strickland believed Duck to be the best candidate to become young Griff's Master at Arms is kind of odd. Yeah, why? I mean, there's no particular connection there that we know of, so it is a little strange, but maybe more on that later. Now, again, we have a parallel to Duncan the Tall. Quite clearly, we talked about Duck, so it's somewhat straightforward. Humble background, being large, serving a Targaryen, joining the Kingsguard. But again, we get this poor copy theme. Duck is no Dunk. Duck's pretty cool. I got nothing against the guy. I like him. He's funny. He's loyal to this young kid, which is, I think, a virtue. But Duncan the Tall is a legend. I mean, this guy stood up to the Targaryens. He stood up to Aerion. He fought a trial by combat. I mean, that's the equivalent. This trial by combat is like the equivalent of Duck, like taking a hammer to Laurent Caswell. So, just again, like it was with Halden and Marwyn, I'm not insulting or criticizing Duck. I'm just saying he doesn't stack up to Duncan. And this whole cast of characters is pretty similar in that regard. Every one of the guys they compare to, they're just not quite enough. Even Connington he's no Bittersteel. Bittersteel was a lot. Bittersteel put together the Golden Company. What has Connington done in that regard? Bittersteel was a notable warrior. Connington's a good warrior, but I don't know if he's on Bittersteel's level. So, just a really overpowering theme here of, yeah, these guys are good, but they're not as good as the ones they're copying. They're not as good as the historical parallel example. They're not equal parallels. They're not on that level. It's really, really overpowering here. So Tree Girl from Flick noticed a similar thing. She wrote it. She expanded on it a bit. It's added on. You got, in addition to Griff being of less than Bittersteel and young Griff being less than Egg or what Rhaegar's son could have been, or as a reminder to the tale of Urax and Serwyn, a poor reflection of a dragon. Haldan's a half-maester, and hey, added on to all that, Tyrion is called the half-man. He isn't really a half-man, but hey, it's kind of fits thematically. So that's pretty cool. More world building around the Rhoyne here. It's pretty subtle. They're just going up and down the Rhoyne. More of that comes out later as they get more involved with the scenery, but it starts a little bit more here. He notices some fountains. He thinks about how this used to be a really nice place until the dragons came. I said this last time, but it's come up again. So check out our Nymeria episodes for our most detailed and thorough takes on the Rhoyne and what happened around that time. Also, Tyrion himself is a historical parallel here to Lomas Longstrider. Now, this might be a different example because I'm not sure I want to call Tyrion a poor copy of Lomas, but maybe he is because Lomas had a defined goal. Lomas went out into the world with the specific purpose of going to all the man-made and naturally made wonders and documenting it. So Tyrion is sort of following in his footsteps by going to so many of the same places. And that's part of why I think he's going to survive to write these stories. But he's going to have gone. Here's a list. Nina has a partial list here. First of all, here's what we know. 9 wonders made by man, 7 natural wonders, 6 or 7 maybe, depending on how you read the assessment of the Walls of Qarth, which are sort of a little of both. And now there's confirmed ones, the Valyrian Roads, the Wall, Titan of Bravos, Triple Bells of Norvos, Long Bridge of Volantis, Palace with 1,000 Rooms, and again, possibly the Triple Walls of Qarth. We only know one of the natural wonders, the Caves of Norvos. Other candidates for the unnatural wonders would be the High Tower, the 5 Forts, and unnatural wonder or natural wonders. Other candidates would be the Rhoyne, the Bone Mountains, maybe Casterly Rock, and the Great Sand Sea. Casterly Rock could be like one of those combo ones, like the Walls of Qarth, maybe. Anyway, so Tyrion's gonna end up going to a lot of these places, not necessarily all of those, but he's seen some of these already, and is gonna probably see some of the ones that maybe even Lomas didn't mention, but or maybe even encounter a few that are on that level that weren't cited as Lomas by that point. So on one hand, you can see how he's a poor cop because he's going to these places without that same intent and without documenting it and all that. But still, I like that. It's pretty cool. Also, another kind of chilling parallel to Bran, and as a hint to what Tyrion's role is going to be going forward, and maybe the type of advice he gives Daenerys, the kind of things we were worried about. Well, here's a quote.
No matter, Griff. You are no knight, and I'm Hugor Hill, a little monster. Your little monster, if you like.
Right, that's
Straight out
cool.
of Lady Gaga.
Your little monster. Your monster, Griff Connington, or whatever you want to call him. That's really cool. So Tyrion is cold hands, and that's somewhat fitting too because of the Dornishman's Wife's song, which isn't in this chapter, but it is in John 3, which is 2 chapters from now, and of course that song pops up all over the place with great symbolic meaning. Liet Rubenfeld asked, do you think the Targaryens may have books prophesizing Phagon, which is why Baelor locked his sisters in a tower and Bloodraven and Egg were so obsessed about the Blackfyres? Well, that's a really interesting idea. That's entirely possible. I mean, if they can dream of the future, they can dream of dragons. Why not dream of these false dragons or these attempts to usurp their dynasty? That's an interesting idea. I like that a lot. I've never heard that. That's pretty cool. I'm going to need to marinate on that some more. Great take. Rolling Knight noticed a bit of a parallel, 3 parallels in description here. We have the statue. This is in reference to Illyrio's being young Griff's dad and Blackfyre in general. Lithe and handsome is how the statue is described. And then when we meet young Griff, he is a lithe and well-made youth. And in the Mystery Knight, a young man, lean and lithe, is the description of John the Fiddler, a.k.a. Daemon II Blackfyre. Very interesting. Yes, common takes amongst their description, a very specific use of the word lithe. Lithe is used out there a few other places to describe people. It's not super unique as a description, but it's definitely not common Other examples of characters that have that description are Renly and Asha and Satin. So it's definitely not common, but it's been out there. Violent Messiah 666 says, if he gets Darkstar with Dawn on his Kingsguard, it fits with the poor reflection of Sir Arthur. Thoughts? Nailed it. Yes, absolutely. I've said this before. I think that it would fit beautifully with this theme of poor copies to have Darkstar in place of Arthur Dayne. You got Rhaegar's son instead of Rhaegar. You got Arthur Dayne with Rhaegar, so trying to look like Rhaegar's son. Why not also have a Dayne on your Kingsguard wielding the same sword? Yes, but of course, personality-wise, and probably swordsmanship as well, Gerald Dayne, poor copy of Arthur Dayne, right? That's a straightforward one. So good catch there, Violent Messiah 666. I 100% agree. I know I've said so before, though I can't remember where exactly. Probably just when we talked about Darkstar, but I don't know. Anyway, Stefan B says, why were Sir Raleigh and Duck headed up to meet with Illyrio in the first place? Well, news is one thing. They were exchanging news, but Tyrion might have been part of it. Illyrio may have thought it was that important to give them Tyrion, but also the sword. And whatever was in that letter. Tyrion didn't get to read it. Griff burned it. And he wanted to read it, but there may have been more information in there that was useful. But definitely there was information about Tyrion in the letter, but probably other stuff too. Stephanie the Peerless wonders, why is Haldon so rude to Tyrion? Possibly it relates to, just wanting to be the smartest guy in the room. That's a thing that a lot of smart people do. Smart people with low self-esteem or just a bad attitude don't like it when someone else around seems to be as knowledgeable as they are. I think George is almost certainly familiar with this concept, running in circles of smart people and writers and gamers and stuff like that.
I feel like Halden would also have a little bit of extra negativity towards Tyrion for his privilege. Like, obviously Tyrion has his own issues, but like he was,
Yeah,
top of society.
that's a good point. Also, and just we always have to throw in that people just tend to look down on him because he's a dwarf. I mean, that's true. There's prejudice too. That is extremely common throughout Tyrion's arc. People just are rude to him because of what he looks like. So that's there too. It's always hard to judge because O'Shea is totally right. People judge him for his extreme privilege, but they also judge him for his appearance, and those are opposite reactions, right? Well, not opposite, but it's hard to tell one from the other, which is driving that, and because it's often both. And we come back to as well the theme of pieces not behaving the way they want, the players want. Varys and Illyrio have had a lot of pieces do things they did not predict or expect or comprehend. So it's a dichotomy of expectations. On one hand, yeah, they can count on Griff to protect and truly care about this kid because he believes it's Rhaegar's son and he was in love with Rhaegar, all that. That loyalty can be depended on. That doesn't mean he's going to obey their orders or their suggestions, though. What he thinks is right for this kid isn't necessarily always going to be what they think, because they all have different goals here. Yes, they want that kid on the throne, but Griff wants things from him on the throne. He has a different reason for wanting him on the throne than than Illyrio and Varys does. Although maybe it's more similar than I'm saying. I mean, if they all are, if Varys's thing is personal, if Illyrio's thing is personal, well, hey, Griff's thing is personal too. He wants it's all about his relationship. So maybe I'm exaggerating that point a little bit, but still, the main point is Varys and Illyrio can't control this guy, even though they fully understand his motivations, and that part is not in doubt. Interesting too that Tyrion is still claiming to kill Joffrey. It adds to his reputation a little bit. We know he didn't do it, but it's official. It's an official story. He lost his trial by combat. So the world thinks that he's guilty. He may as well lean into that. They believe he did it. In this company, it might actually be a benefit. So, hey, do it. On Facebook, poster Shannon Ruth pointed out this take of Cora the Cruel. And it's not meant to be a theory that we have a lot of evidence for, but the suggestion that somewhere out there is Tysha. We always love thinking Tysha could be this character or this character. It would be oddly fitting for someone who has gone through such horrible things to turn that around on people. Now, that's not a healthy way to respond to that, but it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility by any means to be the person who goes around cutting off members. But I'm guessing we'll never hear from Cora the Cruel again. Still, I like the idea. Davos won! The gang goes to the sisters, aka Webbed Fingers and Red Herrings. A fairly unique chapter in that it is one of the more capable of standing alone as a story by itself. It's also one that showcases some of George's influences couched in the usual manner, world building. His world building influences are many and varied and deep and interesting, and we love to pay attention to that. This one features a lot of subtle background elements that we've been pointing to whenever they appear, and this time they're not subtle. I mean, actual webbed fingers and apparently toes too. Hello, squishers. Hello, deep ones. All that fun stuff. The Lovecraft influence on this chapter is substantial. If you've read the story The Shadow over Innsmouth, well, you may have noticed the crossover already. I won't spoil it, but parallels are pretty strong. The first line of this story, though, or this chapter, rather, is a nod to a different author altogether, not Lovecraft. It references the central theme of this chapter, storms.
Lightning split the northern sky, etching the black tower of the night lamp against the blue-white sky.
Archmaester Rennie reminds us that Jack Vance, a favorite of George's, there is a house Vance, wrote a novel called The Night Lamp. So there you go. So this isn't a long chapter. It's actually one of the shorter ones, but there's a lot of rabbit holes as well as this standout setting. The overwhelming darkness of this chapter, it's just so well done. I don't mean metaphorical darkness, but I do mean that too. I mean like literal darkness. It's dark. But also this concept of the great night lamp. It's so cool. It's the inversion of a lighthouse. It's instead of your last hope, it's actually the thing leading you to your death. It's actually worse. So when he meets Lord Borel, George shows the dark and how the light within the darkness and how the light is actually the darkness. Ooh. Quote.
They found the Lord alone in the gloom of his hall, making a supper of beer and bread and sister stew. 20 iron sconces were mounted along his thick stone walls, but only 4 held torches, and none of them was lit. 2 fat tallow candles gave a meager, flickering light. Davos could hear the rain lashing at the walls and a steady dripping where the roof had sprung a leak.
The suggestion that this place is the only light in the darkness is just, I can't get over that. It's so creepy. This place is a refuge. This place? No. Nina writes, a poor, rundown, cold, lonely port town full of strange and unseemly characters, so having Godric sporting a possible vestige of the Deep One's heritage fits perfectly in the setting. Yeah, and there's this quote.
Sisterton is hell enough. Davos feared the worst. The 3 sisters were fickle bitches, loyal only to themselves.
Suggestion not made openly in the text, but perhaps implied, is that the ominous storming outside is actually a good thing. We don't feel that. Davos doesn't feel that. But if you put yourself in Lord Borrell's place, it is. Davos's life is in Lord Borrell's hands, and a storm is a bad omen. It's a literary device really common to indicate such, as well as one of the worst things there is to a sailor like Davos. So personally to him, it's ominous. For readers, we're used to storms meaning ominous things, but the guy sitting there dictating what's going to happen, the guy in charge, the storm puts him in a good mood. He likes the storms. So that's a real interesting piece of perspective that's hard to wrap your mind around, but it's a really clever aspect of this chapter. He thinks of some of the worst winds he's ever felt, Davos does, because he's, that's what it puts him in the mood for. He thinks that those worst winds were after the burning of Alistair Florent, when those winds supposedly drove them north to Eastwatch. And by the way, Alistair Florent arguably has king's blood, but arguably doesn't, because the Florents haven't been kings for so long. Davos thinks Davos had misliked that wind. It had seemed to him to smell of burning flesh, and the sound of it was anguished as it played amongst the lines. So, whoa. I mean, maybe that's just his subconscious, his guilt or something, or just the haunting being of the memory of a man being burned in front of him. But yeah. So, like I said, though, storms are a bad thing for just about everyone. But again, matter perspective. George is so good at flipping perspective and showing us these kind of things. And well, what's one man's famine is another man's feast. Almost literally here. Quote.
Storms, Lord Godric said the word as fondly as another man might say his lover's name. Storms were sacred on the sisters before the Andals came. Our gods of old were the Lady of the Waves and the Lord of the Skies. They made storms every time they made it. He leaned forward. These kings never bother with the sisters. Why should they? We are small and poor. And yet, you're here, delivered to me by the storms.
This is extremely unusual. I mean, most real-world cultures saw storms as anger of the gods, or that there was a storm god and he was doing his thing, or she, or they have a temper. They're not terribly trustworthy because they're temperamental, and you just never know when they're going to come upon, get angry, and thunder and lightning and rain comes suddenly. There's exceptions, of course. I mean, any culture that lives in a really dry place is going to be happy with just about any kind of rain, but they still may have a storm god. And very often these storm gods and goddesses are described as temperamental. And Davos spends a good portion of the chapter thinking of how much damage they've done to Salah's fleet and thus to Stannis. These storms are just, he just keeps thinking of all the problems these storms have caused. Nina writes, the old gods the Borals once worshipped, not the old gods, but these older gods, the Lady of the Waves and the Lord of the Skies, are reminiscent of the story of Durin Godsgrief, whose bride Elenai was daughter of the sea god and the goddess of the wind. And obviously, they sent storms against Durin's successive castles to show their rage at this marriage between a goddess and a person. And, well, that's why the name Storm's End comes from. The ancient sistermen were so poor that shipwrecks were arguably a necessity for their survival. They almost needed these shipwrecks to get by, which is why they look on storms as such a positive thing. I suspect the wood situation is not great on the sisters. It would explain why they aren't a big naval culture despite being islanders. Now
So you would say there's not a lot of wood on the sisters?
Nice. They do have pirate kings in their history, but the Starks shut that down. Maybe they were more of a naval power, and that's just a thing of the past, and they haven't been able to regain that. But it doesn't sound like they were ever a big seafaring culture, even when they were peaking in that department. So storm worship really does fit, given all these circumstances, but it's an unusual set of circumstances. These set of conditions are not likely to occur elsewhere, and as far as we know, haven't. Even the distant and feared and near universally despised Iron Men hate storms to the point that their monotheistic religion has the good guy is the waves and the bad guy is the storms. Yeah. And Davos wonders whether the storms that hit Salador's fleet were the vengeance of an angry god in revenge for the cheating of creating a wind to get north through Melisandre. And, well, while the fact that there's a storm raging this chapter makes Davos and the reader both uncomfortable, again, it's keep in mind, Lord Godric is sitting here kind of feeling pretty good about it. It's a grand matter of perspective. And again, the slow-eyed maid is one of the reasons why he's in a good mood too. He mentions that he just got a new windfall from a shipwreck recently. It sounds like really good stuff, and it sounds like Lord Boral did it on purpose. And here's the description of the kind of things that they do.
Lord Godric's forebears had been pirate kings until the Starks came down on them with fire and sword. These days, the sistermen left open piracy to Salladhor Saan and his ilk, and confined themselves to wrecking. The beacons that burned along the shores of the Three Sisters were supposed to warn of shoals and reefs and rocks, and lead the way to safety. But on stormy nights and foggy ones, some sistermen would use false lights to draw unwary captains to their doom.
This perspective will shift dramatically in the next chapter because Davos is going to talk to a man who mentions the slow-eyed maid. He met one of the crew members. And Davos is already aware what the implication here when he says the slow-eyed maid. He understands that this loot came off a shipwreck, because where else would it come from? But he didn't know that he was going to immediately meet someone who had met a member of the slow-eyed maid's crew. And he thinks, how cruel are the gods to send a ship all the way to the Jade Gates and all the way back only to be destroyed right at the end of their voyage. But again, perspective. We don't agree with it. I'm with Davos. Like, that is cruel. But Lord Borrell is thanking the gods for this. And that brings us to White Harbor. More to say on it when we get there, but there's a lot of history about White Harbor in this chapter. A lot of northern history as applied to the sisters and the back and forth. Now, we won't get too deep into that because we have 2 full episodes on House Manderley, so I direct you there. We talk about the sisters, the rape of the 3 sisters. After that, those generations of piracy, that's what the Starks did to shut them down. It involved flaying and entrails and all sorts of things that sound somewhat similar to how they would sacrifice people to their heart trees. That storyline continues in White Harbor, and for example, well, here's one of the quotes.
"I have no love for Northmen," he announced. "The maesters say the rape of the 3 sisters was 2,000 years ago, but Sisterton has not forgotten. We were a free people before that, with our kings ruling over us. Afterward, we had to bend our knee to the Eyrie to get the Northmen out. The wolf and the falcon fought over us for 1,000 years, till, between the 2 of them, they had gnawed all the fat and flesh off the bones of these poor islands."
Some bitterness, and it sounds somewhat justified. Not enough to feel sorry for this particular man, but perhaps feel sorry for some of his people, maybe. Interesting, too, that even on the sisters, despite these differences and hatred for these other cultures that caused them so much harm, they adhere to the ancient laws of hospitality here, too. So that's pretty interesting. Like, Davos feels legitimately comforted by the breaking of bread, and he appears to be correct in feeling that way. In a chapter full of fish, too, we get a red herring story. Red herring story, of course, means it's a form of foreshadowing, but it's intentionally so. You know, it's set up that way. It's intended to mislead rather than foreshadowing is something that George kind of changed his mind on. The tale of Ned Stark getting a child on a fishwife, of course, is what we're referring to. I like Stefan B's take, one of our Flick commenters, that this is a suggestion to the reader that there is a question re Jon Snow's parentage, right? If you read A Game of Thrones for the first time, you may not even pick up on the fact there's a question about Jon's parentage at all, other than the obvious that he doesn't know who they are, or that he doesn't know who his mother is, and all that, and there's some maybe hidden details. But you're told that he's Ned Stark's son, and a lot of us on the first read just accepted that. So if you never caught that, well, that's what George is doing here. He's like, look, maybe there is a question as to what this whole story is about. So maybe it's just to kind of get them on that train of thought. Now, that's not necessary for us here, though. We know that all. So, but the suggestion from Stefan, I agree with that. Maybe it's for the more casual reader to take note of. A bit like this is in Tyrion's chapter. The past casts a shadow on the actions taken here. Thanks to the lesson learned by Lord Godric's father in the case of Eddard Stark's visit there, he has an example to work from. A nice low-risk example. Killing Ned Stark probably wouldn't have changed the course of Robert's rebellion, but it definitely gets Robert's and Winterfell's wrath aimed at you, right? And he couldn't have stood up to that, Godric Borrell's father, I mean. There's a risk. That's a big risk. Money isn't worth risking your head on, unless it's a lot of money, maybe, but it wasn't. So Lord Borrell's father, by letting the man go, well, he's still gambling, but neither side of the coin flip is going to result in you losing your head on the coin flip of letting him go. If you kill him, you're taking the chance that you've picked the wrong side and you're committed. But if you just let the guy go, then you haven't really committed and you haven't earned maybe a great reward, but you also haven't earned yourself a great punishment. And the problem with counting on a reward is, well, if you're counting on a reward from the side that loses, well, then that's obviously not going to happen. So that's why it's a low risk method. It's the choosing by not choosing that we mentioned before. And of course, well, same thing. The death of Tywin, as we saw at the start of Feast, is doing similar work at the start of Dance. It's just a huge factor. Everywhere we go, lords are making decisions on who to back based on the fact that Tywin has died. Aegon's invasion with the Golden Company and all that is fast-tracked because of Tywin's death, in part because of Tywin's death. That's not the whole reason, obviously, but it's part of it. Here comes a nice little wordplay bit that I really appreciate.
Any man can steal a ribbon, the Lord said, but those fingers do not lie. You are the Onion Knight.
Well, Lord Borrow's going to have to learn that fingers are not hips. Hips don't lie, but fingers do. As we see in White Harbor, those fingers are definitely going to lie. Some thief is going to be put up there in Davos's place with an onion shoved in his mouth, and everyone's going to think it's Davos, but those fingers lie. Good one, George. Good one. I enjoy watching Davos think his way through all this and this problem of what this Lord wants. And he starts with thinking of things that Davos would want. He thinks of Stannis. He's like, duty, honor, just. Nah, that's not what this guy wants. No, this guy does not care about that at all. This guy is looking out for his own neck. And so Davos's argument is really smart. He's like, look, do you really want to be on the losing side? Are you sure Stannis is going to lose? It's a boy king backed by his mom, who's not the most stable genius in the world. So, you know. So I really like that. It's really well done. It's a good understanding. It's a good writing, a good take on the cynicism and bottom line pragmatism that a lot of these lords hold. It's true that we hear this talk of like the common men don't care who sits the throne as long as the lords leave them alone when they play their Game of Thrones. That's true for these lesser lords as well. These ones that don't have that much power, that if they choose the wrong side, they're screwed just as much as some of these common folk, except that they actually have a choice. That's one of the big differences. The commoners don't have a choice on what side they take. They're like, well, I live on these lands, so I fight for this guy. But still, when the High Lords play, everyone suffers. So, a fun surprise, too, is just how big a deal it's set up that Wyman Manderley is a failure or a weakling. It's just every single person talks about, oh, he can't keep a promise. He's weak-willed. He's just a big fat guy. There's just so many different angles to denigrate this man. So that's just sets up the North Remembers reveal so well, because there's just nothing but criticism and shame heaped on this guy that turns out to be pretty solid. Also, great catch by Joe. A lot of people have looked at the tower that Stannis is currently sitting at, the watchtower out near the Crofters village that he's got his fire burning, as a similar angle to the night lamp here, as a false light. He's leading the Frey army to their doom by leading them out onto a lake that's going to collapse under them. And, well, we hear in this chapter that Stannis has been to Sisterton. He's been to Sweet Sister. He's seen the night lamp. So it's kind of cool that maybe he got the idea from the sisters. He specifically told Lord Burrell, hey, man, if we find out you're using your night lamp to lure ships to their doom, your head's next. So he's been confronted with this exact strategy, and now he might be using it, a variation of it in the north, that's pretty cool. The Davos is found in a seedy smuggler's bar called the Belly of the Whale, which is almost surely a reference to Jonah and the whale, the story of that, Nineveh and all that. Davos was carrying exactly 12 gold dragons, they say, and Jonah is one of the 12 minor prophets in a bunch of versions of Christianity and Judaism. So without getting into all that, he's a figure that spans most all major religions. Not most all, but most major. I mean, in Judaism, all of Christianity and some of Islam. So that's a lot of it. Definitely not all of it, but quite a lot. So that's pretty cool. And here's another quote. Let's talk about the mark for a second.
The woman brought them a fresh loaf of bread, still hot from the oven. When Davos saw her hand, he stared. Lord Godric did not fail to make note of it. Aye, She has the mark, like all Burrells for 5,000 years. My daughter's daughter.
Okay, so it's creepy, no doubt, but that's not the entire point here. We've covered so much of this. I don't need to rehash the deep ones and all that, the mermen and all these different cool undersea races that are very clearly real, but maybe not terribly relevant to the full plotting of A Song of Ice and Fire. They're just an awesome, fun part of the world building. But they do tell us things. They do tell us a little bit about how these bloodlines work, how these magical bloodlines really can linger for a long time. It's like the Targaryen look maintains. Skin changer bonds occasionally reappear, or several reappear at once in the case of the Starks. These things just don't go away. It's magical. It doesn't, of course, this is not a real world genetics by any means, but George is showing us the rules of his genetic system by showing these things can linger, presumably because of magic, for long periods of time, really long periods of time. Our Werewood episodes, we go into some of that indirectly with talking about houses that seem to have a distinct look. There seems to be a pattern with houses that have a distinct look with heart trees. Obviously, this would not be one of those examples. This house doesn't have a heart tree. They don't have a distinct look necessarily. They have a distinct feature, which is not necessarily the same thing. Maybe that's just semantics. But anyway, Jon Snow, again, I'll bring this up, mentioned it already, but Slint calls Jon, he has the mark of the beast because of this thing of being a skin changer. So this concept is out there, and it's familiar in its distribution, that it's lingers since super ancient times and continues to have this potency. Nina writes, from Duck, the honest man in an inverted cause, we now have Davos, the truly honest man in an honest cause. He's not offended by Lord Godric not giving him lordly style or calling him the Onion Knight, but he's deeply offended by being called a turncloak. And he's like, look, call me whatever you want, but I am not that. He really cares about that. He cares about being seen that way, and he's earned it. He will live and die as a king's man in his mind, and that is how he's lived his life. And we've seen inside his head, so we know how sincere he is. One of Salador's ships is called the Sathos San, which is most certainly named after his ancestor, a Lysine pirate who was sent to destroy Corsair strongholds in the Basilisk Isles, but instead took them over and became king of the Basilisk Isles for 30 years. Maybe Salador San here is going to declare himself king of the Stepstones, like the rogue prince Daemon Targaryen did. I mean, he won't be like Daemon, but Daemon was king of the Stepstones. So there's also some of our commenters were wondering if there's any chance Salador will hook up with Aurane Waters, which I don't have any direct thoughts on that other than it's possible. I don't have any, there's no literary evidence pointing to that, no clues that I know of, but it's certainly out there. Nina also writes, it's funny that Davos' argument is that Salador should stay with Stannis because Tommen will never pay Stannis' debts if he emerges victorious, considering that's exactly what Tycho Nestoris puts on Stannis in exchange for backing. He's like, look, we're going to back you, but part of backing you is that you have to pay Tommen's debts too. And that's why we're coming to you in the first place. So that it's kind of funny how that worked out. There was another one of these ironies. And there's even more Blackfyre stuff in this chapter because why not? Why not? They're everywhere. Just one of the many reasons I'm so sure they matter is Godric brings them up, saying, look, even we had to fight in the Blackfyre rebellions thanks to being beholden to our overlords, the Sunderlands. The Sunderlands are the ones who rule the three sisters, so the Borrells have to do fealty to them. And, well, they're not happy that they were dragged into two different, the first and third, it seems like, were the ones they were in. And they had to probably pay ransoms or restitutions or suffer some sort of losses for that. And, well, it just hasn't been good for them. Anytime they rise for a king, it just doesn't work out. Like, this is a history of just, it's better if they stay out of things. And they're not terribly capable of doing a lot of help anyway because of they're poor. And, well, that's true. I mean, Lord Borrell wasn't like concealing his wealth or something. Well, maybe he was, but his roof was actually leaking. So it doesn't seem, if he's concealing his wealth, he's really going full bore with the lie. He's really committing to it. It also in Fire and Blood, we know that the Sunderlands crowned a queen during Aegon's conquest, and we're like, we're an independent nation now. Like, that didn't hold for very long. So soon enough, Torrhen Stark was getting ready to head there, and Vhagar and Visenya were going to go, and they're like, actually, never mind. Sorry, forget that. They didn't want to get burned by Vhagar, yeah, so they gave up pretty quickly on that. Michael Shelton says there were people in Cornwall known as wreckers who would lure ships onto the rocks in order to loot them. So this is a real world example. That's Cornwall is the arm that juts off the southern tip of England going westward. So I didn't know Cornwall had wreckers. I knew it had some rough seas around that area, so that clearly fits. Right on. Tree Girl also notices the bridge of black basalt that Davos walks over, and when black basalt is wet, it looks like the oily black stone. And there's some possibility that the oily black stone is basalt, maybe modified basalt. For more on the oily black stone, the strange stone, check out our Great Empire of the Dawn episode. Also, the way the night lamp is described is a lot like the Tower card in tarot, which is a segue for me to be able to mention that our very own Rebea, Lady of Waves, is her nickname. How perfect is that, given this chapter? Has started doing for fun a Song of Ice and Fire character tarot readings for each chapter, or for some of the chapters each week, or for one character each week gets a reading, and those have been pretty fun. Check it out on our Facebook group. I really love the description of that stew. It's so tasty sounding. There's a site called feastofstarlight.com, just feastofstarlight.com. I believe Ashay is pasting the link into the chat right now, but you can just look it up, feastofstarlight.com. They made up the recipe based on this, on the description. And I love the quote, "It was the sort of stew that warmed a man right down to his bones. Just the thing for a wet, cold night. Davos spooned it up gratefully." To me, it's another example, too, of not just of George's food descriptions, which we are well familiar with how great they are, but it's the sensory descriptions. Remember how I've been talking about how that's a big part of this book, about getting us to trigger, to feel our own senses, to think of taste and smell and touch and sound and all that. And what did I leave out? Sight. And so just more little bits like that where we were put into a character's sense, not just their thoughts and their intellect and their conflicts. And it comes with yet another cannibal reference, right? I just described how tasty it is, but to Godric Boral, again, it's a little matter of perspective. He mentions that I only eat the spider crabs if they're mixed into the sister stew because it makes me feel a cannibal. And then he points at his sigil. His sigil is the spider crab. This is, Nina believes, set up for the Frey pies, when we have multiple Freys in a pie, as well as all the regular food that's in there. So... And of course, it's not just the setup for the Frey pies, but the mentioning of cannibalism just triggers so many other thoughts, because the cannibalism theme is really ramping up, as I have been saying quite a lot. And you've probably noticed without my pointing it out. All right, let's move on to the final chapter of the day. Oh, wait. Carol Funk Super Chat says, "I have a Westeros cookbook and my daughter made me sister stew for my birthday down to the saffron. It was delicious." Oh, so it's also in the Westeros cookbook. So there's maybe two versions of it out there. Or maybe Feast of Starlights is the same. I don't think it is. I think it's a different version. I think they worked out their own. So that's cool. Maybe we'll have to work out both versions. And how cool that your daughter did that for you, Carol. That's awesome. You sounds like you raised your daughter well. She's making you sister stew for your birthday. That's good move there. All right. Now we do John 3. One realm, one god, one king, aka the one with Non-Mance burning. We ended the last John chapter with an execution. Looks like we're starting this one with the same, as we see Mance for the first time since the battle beneath the wall. We actually do see Mance, even though Mance is not the one being burned, because we do see Rattleshirt, and that's the actual Mance. But we actually haven't seen him on page for a long time, and, well, we'll actually have to wait to really see and talk to him. So that's kind of funny. And the chapter begins like this.
They brought forth the king beyond the wall with his hands bound by hempen rope and a noose around his neck.
Yeah, of course. Not really him. Actual Rattleshirt, who looks like Mance's denials and frantic yellings. are easily dismissed the first time, right? You're like, he denies who he is. He's denying his kingship. He's talking about witchery and all this stuff. It's filtered through John's perspective. John isn't even registering the specific words a lot of times. He's like, he's just yelling about this and that. A lot of times you don't get the specific dialogue. John is not aware that glamours exist. So why would it even cross his mind that this would be somebody else? Later, he's going to learn about it, and then maybe it'll cross his mind more often. He's like, wait, actually, is that a glamour? And that actually has happened into the fandom as well. The moment glamours were fully revealed definitively to be a thing, it kind of had a bad effect, I have to say, a negative impact on the theorizing within this fandom. People started coming up with some bad ideas.
I would also say that in world, that would mess me up.
Yeah, right?
I would be so paranoid. I would not trust anyone. It would be rough.
You'd have to have some sort of signal, like that you'd have to change.
Yeah, you would.
In fact, this is a concept introduced and gone very deep in the story. It's The Dying of the Light, George's first full-length novel. And this whole concept of how can you really tell who someone is? And it involves similar, like, skin-changing sort of concepts and flaying as well. So some of the early concepts of the Boltons and stuff like this, I, again, reiterate my promise that we'll do that book one day. Because it has so many amazing proto ideas, and it's a great story on its own, too. So John is clearly prepared in advance to end Mance's suffering. His archers, the four of them, respond to a prearranged signal. He's like, okay, guys, pull out your arrows, shoot him now. No, he's like, now, and they do it. So it was obviously prearranged. Some part mercy, but on the legal end, he still has jurisdiction over Mance's life. Just like he's been fighting with Stannis over this exact thing. He's like, look, these are my castles. These are the Night's Watch castles. You can't just take them. Same thing here. That's a deserter to the Night's Watch. We get to execute him. He said our words. He didn't swear an oath to you, Stannis. He swore an oath to the Night's Watch. We should be the ones to execute him. But that's just Stannis is being the 800-pound gorilla and taking it for himself. Though technically the arrows kill him. This is the first of many burnings in this book. It's interesting, Nina writes, that the wall is weeping when the false Mance is burned. Is that because of Melisandre's powers? Is the heat generated so great? Is the magic part of it? Certainly the heat of the flames is mentioned as intense in this one. The wildlings are backing away, covering their eyes. It's just really bad. She's going to later think in her one chapter about this being a hinge of the world and how her powers are strengthened at the wall. And that is probably it. That's probably the explanation. But we're seeing it in play here. Now, if this is your first reread, well, this is your first time to get or rather not your first time. This is another example of we get the answer before we get the riddle. Lightbringer is as bright as we've seen it too, apparently. John says, but not like this. Never before like this. It's really bright. People are covering their eyes. A horse throws his rider. It's so bright. It's really outstanding and clearly more so than it's been before. John says it's the sun made steel. John and thus the reader wonder if this is the effect of the king's blood and the burning and the sacrifice, but of course it can't be. But when you read this chapter for the first time, you don't know the hinge of the world business necessarily, or you haven't processed that fully. And you don't know that that's not Mance. Especially if you've seen the TV show. That's the one that's really a real big whoa for people who saw the show first and then read this chapter. They were not seeing that coming at all, because in the show, it was straight up Mance. It really was Mance that was burned. So that's a real twist for show watchers. A big open question is whether or not Stannis knows about the switch. I think he does. I'm not super confident, but I'm pretty confident. His line to John about talking to Mance, he says, I talked with him for a while and he's cunning. That's interesting. Mance's cunning is that he would cite that. Also, we know without that conversation, we can just guess that Mance could be potentially very useful to Stannis, given his knowledge of Winterfell, his knowledge of the North, and of course, his skills as a leader and as a fighter. Let alone that. Mance would have handled his death more bravely. right? If that had been the real Mance standing in a cage there, he would have not screamed and cried. I mean, he would have screamed because the pain is so intense, but he wouldn't have been yelling about it's not me and no, blah blah blah. It would have been a lot calmer. He would have been braver about facing his death because that's Mance Rayder. That's just the guy he is. And well, doesn't it serve Stannis and Melisandre's purpose more to make the king of the free folk look like more of a weakling when he's going to his death? So there's another advantage to Stannis and Melisandre here by doing the switch, which again argues that Stannis is aware. Because Stannis, one thing we've seen about Stannis, yeah, he cares about justice and duty, but he cares about the appearance of it more than the actual doing of it. He cares about both. He cares about advantages and winning more so than adhering to a perfect sense of justice. I say that while still believing he is probably the most just of all the kings we've seen so far. Arguably, not definitely. But in this, he's very human in that he still prefers to take advantages over being pure. And we've seen Stannis was willing to burn his own cousin. Of course he's willing to be deceitful about this if he's willing to burn an innocent. Come on. Some people think Stannis would not do this kind of deception. I think that's a poor counter argument. There are good counter arguments here, but Stannis wouldn't do that isn't one of them. He's desperate for advantages. He's desperate to get back in the fight. Mance is an advantage. If he can make use of that advantage, he's not going to throw it away just to make justice seem like it's being done. When he has a way to do both, he can have his cake and eat it too. So I think that's very clear. But let's not also forget the burning of the horn. This horn is a really big part of the chapter. It's really interesting. I'm really fascinated by what this thing was. Here's the quote.
Joramun had died thousands of years ago, but Mance had found his grave beneath a glacier, high up in the Frostfangs, and Joramun blew the horn of winter and woke giants from the earth. Ygritte had told Jon that Mance never found the horn. She lied, or else Mance kept it secret even from his own.
So I agree with Tormund that it's a shame that the thing was burned. Like, that's what Tormund's going to say later. 8 feet long. I mean, damn, what was that thing? Huh. Melisandre is grandiose as usual, and given the deception and the execution, why not be grandiose about the horn? She calls it the Horn of Darkness, and again refers to Stannis as Azor Ahai. And this is Melisandre's genius here. She's a master of misdirection, illusion, and persuasion. This is a performance and a microcosm of her overall game. Real power backed by fake power, which amplifies that real power. Absolutely no one actually knows what that horn would have done if blown. We never saw it blown. We have no idea. So literally no one can claim to know what it would have done. But Melisandre acts as if it's confirmed to be what Mance claimed. A force capable of taking down the wall. It's very clever. It's like fake artifact Aikido. Mance is the one that convinced everyone it could do that. She's just saying, yeah, he's right. She's using the perception that Mance generated as an advantage for her and Stannis. She's saying, Azor Ahai is burning the Horn of Darkness for y'all. He's the good guy here. And it wouldn't have been possible without Mance making that horn into a big deal in the first place. It's really well done by she just totally pivots. She just 180s Mance's intent here. And I think it's fascinating and clever. Now here's a look ahead, right? Her POV. We only get her one POV, but she does think back on this Rattlemance burning, and it's useful for us to take that into account while we're analyzing this scene.
She made it sound a simple thing and easy. They need never know how difficult it had been or how much it had cost her. That was a lesson Melisandre had learned long before Ashai. The more effortless the sorcery appears, the more men fear the sorcerer. When the flames had licked at Rattleshirt, the ruby at her throat had grown so hot that she feared her own flesh might start to smoke and blacken. Thankfully, Lord Snow had delivered her from that agony with his arrows. While Stannis had seethed at the defiance, she had shuddered with relief.
So there you go. It's exactly what I was talking about. She's pretending the magic is easy to make a show, to make her seem more powerful. She suffers in silence. And that's kind of ironic, but true. At the same time, he looks at Val, John does, and sees how strong she is because she's just watching all this and not blinking and handling it so well. And John thinks the women are the strong ones. And meanwhile, Melisandre's here suffering like physically great pain so much that she's afraid her own flesh is going to start smoking and blackening. It is that intense. Other people have the same thought about the women being the strong ones. Aris Oakheart has that thought. Now, right here with John and Stannis, his speech here to the free folk, it's really quite something too. We're not meant to see this as like good, but it is strong. Quote.
Westeros has but one king, said Stannis. His voice rang harsh with none of Melisandre's music. With this sword I defend my subjects and destroy those who menace them. Bend the knee and I promise you food, land, and justice. Kneel and live, or go and die. The choice is yours.
I mean, what kind of choice is that, really? Again, this isn't really a choice. He's not offering them a real choice. It's technically a choice, but like, what kind of choice is this? You can't really refuse when you're desperate. This chant of one realm, one god, one king is pretty fascist in its imagery, really. You may not agree. You may feel differently, but I don't think George wants us to look at this and think, good. This is good. This is positive. Despite the lives being saved, that aspect is good, but that's not the whole picture. You can't just say, lives saved, good. That's it, and be the end of it. It's not that simple. We all know that saving a life is just the beginning. What good is it to save a life if you just abandon them to die 10 minutes later? You haven't saved anything. And, well, a few of them still reject it. They do treat it as the choice that it ultimately truly is. But, quote,
but most came on. Behind them was only cold and death. Ahead was hope. They came on, clutching their scraps of wood until the time came to feed them to the flames. R'hllor was a jealous deity, ever hungry. So the new god devoured the corpse of the old and cast gigantic shadows of Stannis and Melisandre upon the wall, black against the ruddy red reflections on the ice.
I mean, that doesn't sound good, does it? It doesn't sound positive or uplifting. It sounds like, yeah, it's good that their lives are being saved, but that's the only positive here. All these other things, it's like, well, they're facing awfulness after that. The later too, there's some amazing imagery. The pit fire was burning low, and the king's shadow on the wall had shrunk to a quarter of its former height. So it's this powerful moment, but it doesn't last very long. I think that's maybe the subtext is this great grand display is not going to carry forward the way they want it to, because they're not emboldening loyalty here. There's no compassion. There's no humanity here. Burning a chunk of weirwood is not to be taken lightly. This is huge. Imagine a huddled group of refugees that want access to a country, and to do it, to get access to that country, they have to burn a few pages of the Bible or the Quran or the Torah or something like that. Just think of a holy book, and to get to be able to be accepted, to get food, you have to burn sacred parts of your old religion. Like, are you really going to be that thankful? You're going to be like, well, I'm not going to say anything about it because, like, I'm in a tough spot right now, and I'm not going to be looking up with joy and compassion towards this guy like he's really my savior. I'm going to be like, well, thanks. Because that's not what Stannis wants. He's not out. He's very clearly not here out of compassion. And Dollars Ed breaks it down for us here in his brilliant, sarcastic manner.
Not to say that the wildlings mean us harm. Aye, we hacked their gods apart and made them burn the pieces, but we gave them onion soup. What's a god compared to a nice bowl of onion soup? I could do with one myself.
To surrender deeply held beliefs or face certain death. This is hateful stuff. Again, no compassion. And on top of that, they've lost all this other hope. Not only are they starving, but they had this hope in that horn, which was just burned in front of them too. So, and their leader. He's not saving them so much as he is conscripting them. And that's what rubs me the wrong way here. Now, he does let them go if they want, but only back north. Like, if you're coming into my realm, you have to obey and you have to fight for me. Now, of course, there's two sides to this, because that's true for a lot of them, but like, the women and children aren't going to have to be conscripted. They actually have a decent deal here. They still have to give up their gods, though. It's awful. But at least they're not going to be forced to fight for Stannis. Recall that, he does want to use them in his army. He's going to put them in the front. That's his plan, and it's probably his plan at this moment. And that switches when Jon says, that's a terrible idea, man. Do not put wildlings in your army and go traipsing around the north, because the north will not join you if you do that, and you need the north far more than you need these wildlings. And of course, Jon's right, but he's not telling the whole story there. He needs to think that through a little more, because you know who hates the wildlings as much as those northern lords is his own brothers, his own sworn brothers. The Night's Watch hate the wildlings too. Quote,
"The realm will curse us all for this," declared Ser Alliser Thorne in a venomous tone. "Every honest man in Westeros will turn his head and spit at the mention of the Night's Watch." What would you know of honest men?
Yeah, I wish he had said that out loud, but he doesn't, because he's the Lord Commander, and he's got to be more disciplined with his words towards his subordinates. But that is almost exactly the same line that Lord Piper says to the Freys in Jaime's War Council. It's like, I say what I mean like an honest man, but what would you know of the ways of honest men? I love that. But this is just that offensive. It's again, George does it so well, because the guy expressing the sentiment is Ser Alliser, and we hate Ser Alliser. We're inclined to disagree with him reflexively, because he's just that terrible. He's like, he is friends with Janos Slynt, so of course. But here he's saying what a lot of people are thinking. And a lot of those people are decent and good people. Alliser is not, this attitude, that disliking of the wildlings, is not the province only of the bad guys. A lot of decent brothers are slow to accept this. Some of them are going to come around on it because Jon's going to convince them. But Jon's job of convincing isn't very well done. Jon does the same thing he does with Gilly, where he's just like, look, this is the reality. You must accept it. Rather than spending a little more time gaining consensus, winning them over, he forces it on them. And, well, they force knives on him. It's just too hard for them to accept these guys as allies. They've been enemies for too long. So many Night's Watch brothers take this really personally because the Free Folk have killed their friends. And they don't love this R'hllor stuff either. We see this expressed by Jon's friends. They poke fun. They're like, the night is dark and full of turnips. And Jon's like, man, you shouldn't make fun of people's beliefs. And they're like, she makes fun of ours. She says there's only one God. So this is a theme of Jon's arc. We see Bowen Marsh come up and act polite about it. He's like, Jon, some of your fellow brothers are worried about how close you're getting to Stannis. Now, Jon doesn't answer this as well as he could have, but the truth is that Stannis is kind of pushing Jon around. Stannis is demanding a lot, and Jon has to give him something. He's able to stand up to him on a lot of things and keep that to a minimum, but Stannis is demanding and overbearing, and there's only so much he can push back against that without causing new problems. Like, stop one problem, cause new problems. And Bowen Marsh isn't necessarily aware of that difficulty. But again, Jon doesn't describe it very well. It's again a callback to Jon's leadership style being a little incomplete. He needs to explain things a little more. But by framing all this through Alliser and Bowen, who we don't know is the guy to really worry about, it's actually really ironic. Jon is being confronted by Bowen, and Bowen is saying things that we know to be worried about because we know what happens later. But Jon is still thinking about Alliser and like, I'm worried about that guy. Whoops. A little more kill the boy stuff in this chapter too. It's almost more painful in some ways, because it's more personal. We actually are in his head. If we were in Gilly's point of view and George was describing her thoughts, it would be a lot more heartrending. where we have this sort of barrier between imagining what's there and not fully experiencing it through a POV. With Jon here, we get it firsthand in his mind that he's separate from his friends now. He's sad that he can't sit down and have dinner with them. This is basic comfort, this basic simple joys of friendship that are gone for him. Now, see, he's kind of wrong though. Again, he's going too far. He's being too hard on himself. He's still allowed to have friends. He has to not put his friendship with them above his duties. But in his mind, he just can't have friends at all, which I think is a little too strict. And so he's creating a little misery for himself, thinking he has to. And this is that love-duty dichotomy that Aemon introduced to him just so long ago. It's like, I think maybe Aemon was maybe a little too strict with that, like you can't have love and duty. Well, they are warring concepts, but they don't completely eliminate each other. It's so sad, Jon's way the chapter ends too. Jon's like, well, this is me. This is it. This is what I gotta be. This is the rest of my life. No friends, just duty. Ugh, that is very bleak, isn't it? It's almost like, yeah, death might improve his circumstances because at least it gives him an out from the Night's Watch. Maybe? I don't know. Nina catches what's possibly another biblical reference. George is just throwing a couple of Bible references here with the, first we had the belly of the whale. Now we have Val stood on the platform as still as if she had been carved of salt. That is a peculiar reference, but it's definitively found in the Bible. Lot's wife, she turned into a pillar of salt for looking back at Sodom while she fled before the city was destroyed, which you weren't supposed to do that. I'm not super strong on my Bible tales, but I sort of recall that part. So not sure why George was getting a little extra biblical with some of these takes here, but maybe there's an overarching reason, a connecting point for some of that. Maybe one of y'all can speak up and make a connection here. All right. One or two more things here. The sealing of the gates is an interesting point here. Bowen suggests they do that. And this is a little hard to keep straight because if you have a memory of the show, Jon was the one arguing to seal the gates in the show. And here he's the one arguing, no, we need to have... He makes kind of the same argument Jeor Mormont makes. He's like, look, we can't seal the gates because we need to have visibility. We need to be able to send men out and scout. If we can't do that, then we're blind. We have to be able to see where the wildlings armies are and all that, especially given the remaining ones out there are some of the most dangerous ones. We've got a lot of the ones that joined, that crossed the barrier, that threw their wood in the fire, that surrendered to Stannis. Those are among the least dangerous. Some of them are dangerous, but they're among the least dangerous. The more dangerous ones are going to come later. A lot of them are going to join as well. But then there's the ones who don't join at all, like the Weeper and a few giants and some other characters. So more on that as those plot lines develop more. Perhaps a little literary symbolism here. Melisandre described as a red shadow. Drogon is the winged shadow, and we have the constant reminders of the others as white shadows, and the Kingsguard as white shadows. Yes. And power is a shadow on the walls, as Shea is writing in the notes here, right on cue. That is very true. Very good call. And that is how all these things are portrayed, right? They're all metaphorical emblems of power. Whereas that is what power itself is. Very cool. Deborah Lynch brings up, why green and other colored flames when the horn burns? Yeah, that's curious. It's another thing about the horn that just has me overflowing with curiosity. What the heck was up with that? So yeah, why is there other colors? What is going on with the runes were burning? I don't know. I wish I had an answer. It might be Melisandre's trickery. Maybe she was just sprinkling a little extra color in there to make the show look a little more spectacular. But maybe she didn't have to. Maybe that just happens anyway because it's just, well, there's magic going on. And her voice. Also, we should take note of her voice, the way it sounds, and there may be magic in it, the music of it. Jon notes how mellifluous it is and how not only that Stannis isn't, but we should consider that there might be some magic in there. There might be some mild hypnotism going on. After all, when she speaks a word to undo the magic of Mance's glamour in front of Jon, in her own mind, she thinks she said a word. Mance hears it, Jon hears it, but they both hear a word different than what she actually says. So the concept is introduced in her own chapter that she can say things that other people hear differently, which is clearly magic. So some of her influence through her speech is like there's an undertone of she's using like a mild form of supernatural hypnotism or some sort of convincing or something's going on there. And that's a good catch because I don't think I noticed that. Or I didn't make that connection between the later point and this speech now. And again, the Dornishman's wife is mentioned here. I brought that up earlier, but this is where it's actually mentioned. It's brought up, and then Mance is going to bring it up when he's Rattleshirt in Melisandre's chapter. As well, I've lived a full life. He's like, if I die, then, well, I've kissed the Dornishman's wife. And of course, he's going to sing the song in Winterfell in front of the Boltons and change the lyrics to A Northman's Daughter. And, well, that's pretty cool. We'll end on that note. Literally. That note. Hey, it's a song. Perfect. Last week, we covered 161 minutes, 34 seconds of the books. This week, it was 149 minutes, 21 seconds. So far, we've covered 442 minutes, 21 seconds out of the 2,920 minutes-ish of the books total. We've covered 15.1%. Lots left to go. As always, you can check the video to see how much we edited out in the pod version. Usually it's 5 to 15, occasionally a little more, but that's the average. Don't forget to like the video and like the podcast version. Leave us a review if you don't mind. It would only take you about 60 seconds. We'd really appreciate it, and it does a lot for getting us noticed by the algorithms, both podcast algorithms and YouTube algorithms. Also, we could use a few new reviews. We had a weird one. Someone accused me on a review of promoting domestic terrorism. Like, what? Like, you guys listen to the podcast. When the hell did I do that? If you know, please tell me, because I'm like, wait, when did I do that? I allude to real world politics, but I never bring them up directly. So I don't think I did that.
Someone else is going to review and be like, and yet again, he brings up domestic terrorism.
That's so
weird, you brought
man.
it up just now, Aziz.
Oh, I guess you're right. Technically, I did bring it up, yeah. So I mentioned, as usual, at the end of the episode, we try to mention the other episodes of amongst our scripted content that this one refers to. Serwyn of the Mirror's Shield was mentioned early on. Bittersteel, The Golden Company, and pretty much the whole Blackfyres series, but particularly those two. Nymeria's episodes are on point, given all the stuff around the Rhoyne here. Great Empire of the Dawn came up, given the Strange Stone. I'm sure there's some others too. I mentioned briefly our Werewood episodes vis-a-vis the characters' looks and all that. Also want to throw out, since we talked about Dunk and Egg so much today, we are going to be covering Dunk and Egg on Valar Rereadis eventually. I have pointed that out before, but you may have missed it. We're going to have Sean for that. So that'll be fun. Next week, 5 chapters, not 4. All right, that's going to be fun. I think it might be the second longest batch that we have. We don't have a 6 chapter week or anything, but in terms of audiobook length, I think this is the longest or second longest of all of the Valar Rereadis for Dance with Dragons. So I will be clear on that when we get there next week. Those 5 chapters include Daenerys 2, This is the Quaith, aka Escalating Ethical Entanglements.
Reek 1, Welcome to the Dreadfort, aka the gang re-meets Theon.
Bran 2, Old Nan's Tales Come Alive, aka the gang meets Bloodraven.
Tyrion 4, The Old Man of the River Comes Alive, aka an education fit for a king.
And Davos 2, Old Fishfoot Doesn't Come Alive, aka an onion eats an apple in White Harbor. What is he, bobbing for apples in the harbor? Yeah, something like that. Well, thanks, everyone. This was particularly fun. I feel like I was even more emphatic than usual. I think I got into it even more. I always get into it, but like I feel like I was like even more of like a preacher today. Just
I feel like you patted yourself on the back less too than normal just now.
Really?
No, of course not. What are you...
No, of course not.
No, I agree, Aziz.
I like it when I'm more
Aziz,
enthusiastic.
who is the best and enthusiastic.
So, thank you everyone for coming. Thanks for the live comments, for the great questions, the great takes. There's so many good ones. As always, you guys bring up things that I didn't notice, things that Nina and Joe didn't notice, things that Ashay didn't notice, things that a lot of people didn't notice. And that's the brilliance of this fandom, is there are so many things to notice, and you guys do it, and we all do it together. Thanks as well to our History of Westeros mods who post the chapters each week on Facebook, generating discussion, showing off cool artwork, all that fun stuff. Thanks to our regular commenters on all of our social media sites, Flick, Facebook, Slack, Discord. Lots of good chats happening over there. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for the maps and video intro. Thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the Valar Rereadis music intro. Thanks to Joey Townsend and Jesse Koval for our regular intro-outro music. Thanks to our Bengineer for making our episodes sound better than they otherwise would. Big, huge thanks to our patrons for the financial support. Support is underselling it. It's really the reason we're able to do this at all. So, lifeblood, that's what you all are. Thank you very much for that. And go to Here Be Dragons. It's only 10 minutes from now if you're watching live. If not, catch it after the fact if you didn't. It's their anniversary stream. Very cool. Amy Blackfyre, a regular commenter and member of the community, is a guest today. So lots of reasons to check that out. I hope you do. I'm going to be in the chat myself. I probably won't be there right at the beginning, but I'll be heading over there soon. Need a short break after this, but see you there, I hope. And if not, well, see you next week for more Valar Rereadis.